Chapter 23 of the New Magdalen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The New Magdalen by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 23. Lady Janet at Bay. The narrative leaves Julian and Mercy for a while, and, ascending to the upstairs regions of the house, follows the march of events in Lady Janet's room. The maid had delivered her mistress's note to Mercy, and had gone away again on her second errand to Grace Roseberry in her boudoir. Lady Janet was seated at her writing-table, waiting for the appearance of the woman whom she had summoned to her presence. A single lamp diffused its mild light over the books, pictures, and busts round her, leaving the further end of the room in which the bed was placed almost lost in obscurity. The works of art were all portraits. The books were all presentation copies from the authors. It was Lady Janet's fancy to associate her bedroom with memorials of the various persons whom she had known in the long course of her life, most of them by this time gathered with the dead. She sat near her writing-table, lying back in her easy-chair, the living realization of the picture which Julian's description had drawn. Her eyes were fixed on the photographic likeness of Mercy, which was so raised upon a little gilt easel as to enable her to contemplate it under the full light of the lamp. The bright, mobile old face was strangely and sadly changed. The brow was fixed. The mouth was rigid. The whole face would have been like a mask, moulded in the hardest forms of passive resistance and suppressed rage, but for the light and life still thrown over it by the eyes. There was something unutterably touching in the keen, hungering tenderness of the look which they fixed on the portrait, intensified by an underlying expression of fond and patient reproach. The danger which Julian so wisely dreaded was in the rest of the face. The love which he had so truly described was in the eyes alone. They still spoke of the cruelly profaned affection which had been the one immeasurable joy, the one inexhaustible hope, of Lady Janet's closing life. The brow expressed nothing but her obstinate determination to stand by the wreck of that joy, to rekindle the dead ashes of that hope. The lips were only eloquent of her unflinching resolution to ignore the hateful present, and to save the sacred past. My idol may be shattered, but none of you shall know it. I stop the march of discovery. I extinguish the light of truth. I am deaf to your words, and blind to your proofs. At 70 years old, my idol is my life. It shall be my idol still. The silence in the bedroom was broken by a murmuring of women's voices outside the door. Lady Janet instantly raised herself in the chair and snatched the photograph off the easel. She laid the portrait face downward among some papers on the table, then abruptly changed her mind, and hid it among the thick folds of lace which clothed her neck and bosom. There was a world of love in the action itself, and in the sudden softening of the eyes which accompanied it. The next moment Lady Janet's mask was on. Any superficial observer who had seen her now would have said, "This is a hard woman." The door was opened by the maid. Grace Roseberry entered the room. She advanced rapidly, with a defiant assurance in her manner, and a lofty carriage of her head. She sat down in the chair to which Lady Janet silently pointed, with a thump. She returned Lady Janet's grave bow with a nod and a smile. Every movement and every look of the little worn, white-faced, shabbily dressed woman expressed insolent triumph, and said, as if in words, "My turn has come." "I am glad to wait on your ladyship," she began, without giving Lady Janet an opportunity of speaking first. "Indeed, I should have felt it my duty to request an interview, if you had not sent your maid to invite me up here." "You would have felt it your duty to request an interview?" Lady Janet repeated very quietly. "Why?" The tone in which that one last word was spoken embarrassed Grace at the outset. It established as great a distance between Lady Janet and herself as if she had been lifted in her chair and conveyed bodily to the other end of the room. "I am surprised that your ladyship should not understand me," she said, struggling to conceal her confusion, "especially after your kind offer of your own boudoir." Lady Janet remained perfectly unmoved. "I do not understand you," she answered, just as quietly as ever. Grace's temper came to her assistance. She recovered the assurance which had marked her first appearance on the scene. "In that case," she resumed, "I must enter into particulars, in justice to myself. I can place but one interpretation on the extraordinary change in your ladyship's behaviour to me downstairs. The conduct of that abominable woman has at last opened your eyes to the deception that has been practiced on you. For some reason of your own, however, you have not yet chosen to recognize me openly. In this painful position something is due to my own self-respect. I cannot and will not permit Mercy Merrick to claim the merit of restoring me to my proper place in this house. After what I have suffered, it is quite impossible for me to endure that. I should have requested an interview, if you had not sent for me, for the express purpose of claiming this person's immediate expulsion from the house. I claim it now as a proper concession to me. Whatever you or Mr. Julian Gray may do, I will not tamely permit her to exhibit herself as an interesting penitent. It is really a little too much to hear this brazen adventuress appoint her own time for explaining herself. It is too deliberately insulting to see her sail out of the room, with a clergyman of the Church of England opening the door for her, as if she were laying me under an obligation. I can forgive much, Lady Janet, including the terms in which you have thought it decent to order me out of your house. I am quite willing to accept the offer of your boudoir, as the expression on your part of a better frame of mind. But even Christian charity has its limits. The continued presence of that wretch under your roof is, you will permit me to remark, not only a monument of your own weakness, but a perfectly insufferable insult to me." There she stopped abruptly, not for want of words, but for want of a listener. Lady Janet was not even pretending to attend to her. Lady Janet, with a deliberate rudeness entirely foreign to her usual habits, was composedly busying herself in arranging the various papers scattered about the table. Some she tied together with little morsels of string, some she placed under paperweights, some she deposited in the fantastic pigeonholes of a little Japanese cabinet, working with a placid enjoyment of her own orderly occupation, and perfectly unaware to all outward appearance that any second person was in the room. She looked up, with her papers in both hands, when Grace stopped and said quietly, "Have you done?" "Is your ladyship's purpose in sending for me to treat me with studied rudeness?" Grace retorted angrily. "My purpose in sending for you is to say something as soon as you will allow me the opportunity." The impenetrable composure of that reply took Grace completely by surprise. She had no retort ready. In sheer astonishment she waited silently with her eyes riveted on the mistress of the house. Lady Janet put down her papers, and settled herself comfortably in the easy-chair, preparatory to opening the interview on her side. "The little that I have to say to you," she began, "may be said in a question. Am I right in supposing that you have no present employment, and that a little advance in money, delicately offered, would be very acceptable to you?" "Do you mean to insult me, Lady Janet?" "Certainly not. I mean to ask you a question." "Your question is an insult." "My question is a kindness, if you will only understand it as it is intended." "I don't complain of your not understanding it. I don't even hold you responsible for any one of the many breaches of good manners which you have committed since you have been in this room. I was honestly anxious to be of some service to you, and you have repelled my advances. I am sorry. Let us drop the subject." Expressing herself in the most perfect temper in those terms, Lady Janet resumed the arrangement of her papers, and became unconscious once more of the presence of any second person in the room. Grace opened her lips to reply with the utmost intemperance of an angry woman, and thinking better of it, controlled herself. It was plainly useless to take the violent way with Lady Janet Roy. Her age and her social position were enough of themselves to repel any violence. She evidently knew that, and trusted to it. Grace resolved to meet the enemy on the neutral ground of politeness, as the most promising ground that she could occupy under present circumstances. "If I have said anything hasty, I beg to apologize to your ladyship," she began. "May I ask if your only object in sending for me was to inquire into my pecuniary affairs, with a view to assisting me?" "That," said Lady Janet, "was my only object." "You had nothing to say to me on the subject of Mercy Merrick?" "Nothing whatever. I am weary of hearing of Mercy Merrick. Have you any more questions to ask me?" "I have one more." "Yes?" "I wish to ask your ladyship whether you propose to recognize me in the presence of your household as the late Colonel Roseberry's daughter?" "I have already recognized you as a lady in embarrassed circumstances, who has peculiar claims on my consideration and forbearance. If you wish me to repeat those words in the presence of the servants, absurd as it is, I am ready to comply with your request." Grace's temper began to get the better of her prudent resolutions. "Lady Janet," she said, "this won't do. I must request you to express yourself plainly. You talk of my peculiar claims on your forbearance. What claims do you mean?" "It will be painful to both of us if we enter into details," replied Lady Janet. "Pray don't let us enter into details." "I insist on it, madam." "Pray don't insist on it." Grace was deaf to remonstrance. "I ask you in plain words," she went on, "do you acknowledge that you have been deceived by an adventuress who has impersonated me? Do you mean to restore me to my proper place in this house?" Lady Janet returned to the arrangements of her papers. "Does your ladyship refuse to listen to me?" Lady Janet looked up from her papers as blandly as ever. "If you persist in returning to your delusion," she said, "you will oblige me to persist in returning to my papers." "What is my delusion, if you please?" "Your delusion is expressed in the questions you have just put to me. Your delusion constitutes your peculiar claim on my forbearance. Nothing you can say or do will shake my forbearance. When I first found you in the dining room, I acted most improperly. I lost my temper. I did worse. I was foolish enough and imprudent enough to send for a police officer. I owe you every possible atonement, afflicted as you are, for treating you in that cruel manner. I offered you the use of my boudoir as part of my atonement. I sent for you, in the hope that you would allow me to assist you, as part of my atonement. You may behave rudely to me, you may speak in the most abusive terms of my adopted daughter. I will submit to anything, as part of my atonement. So long as you abstain from speaking on one painful subject, I will listen to you with the greatest pleasure. Whenever you return to that subject, I will return to my papers." Grace looked at Lady Janet with an evil smile. "I begin to understand your ladyship," she said. "You are ashamed to acknowledge that you have been grossly imposed upon. Your only alternative, of course, is to ignore everything that has happened. Pray count on my forbearance. I am not at all offended. I am merely amused. It is not every day that a lady of high rank exhibits herself in such a position as yours to an obscure woman like me. Your humane consideration for me dates, I presume, from the time when your adopted daughter set you the example by ordering the police officer out of the room." Lady Janet's composure was proof even against this assault on it. She gravely accepted Grace's inquiry as a question addressed to her in perfect good faith. "I am not at all surprised," she replied, "to find that my adopted daughter's interference has exposed her to misrepresentation. She ought to have remonstrated with me privately before she interfered. But she has one fault. She is too impulsive. I have never, in all my experience, met with such a warm-hearted person as she is. Always too considerate of others, always too forgetful of herself. The mere appearance of the police officer placed you in a situation to appeal to her compassion, and her impulses carried her away as usual. My fault, all my fault." Grace changed her tone once more. She was quick enough to discern that Lady Janet was a match for her with her own weapons. "We have had enough of this," she said. "It is time to be serious. Your adopted daughter, as you call her, is Mercy Merrick, and you know it." Lady Janet returned to her papers. "I am Grace Roseberry, whose name she has stolen, and you know that." Lady Janet went on with her papers. Grace got up from her chair. "I accept your silence, Lady Janet," she said, "as an acknowledgment of your deliberate resolution to suppress the truth. You are evidently determined to receive the adventuress as the true woman, and you don't scruple to face the consequences of that proceeding by pretending to my face to believe that I am mad. I will not allow myself to be impudently cheated out of my rights in this way. You will hear from me again, madam, when the Canadian mail arrives in England." She walked toward the door. This time Lady Janet answered, as readily and as explicitly as it was possible to desire. "I shall refuse to receive your letters," she said. Grace returned a few steps threateningly. "My letters shall be followed by my witnesses," she proceeded. "I shall refuse to receive your witnesses." "Refuse at your peril. I will appeal to the law." Lady Janet smiled. "I don't pretend to know much of the subject," she said, "but I should be surprised indeed if I discovered that you had any claim on me which the law could enforce. However, let us suppose that you can set the law in action. You know as well as I do that the only motive power which can do that is money. I am rich. Fees, costs, and all the rest of it, are matters of no consequence to me. May I ask if you are in the same position?" The question silenced Grace. So far as money was concerned, she was literally at the end of her resources. Her only friends were friends in Canada. After what she had said to him in the boudoir, it would be quite useless to appeal to the sympathies of Julian Gray. In the pecuniary sense, and in one word, she was absolutely incapable of gratifying her own vindictive longings. And there sat the mistress of Mablethorpe House, perfectly well aware of it. Lady Janet pointed to the empty chair. "Suppose you sit down again," she suggested. "The course of our interview seems to have brought us back to the question that I asked you when you came into my room. Instead of threatening me with the law, suppose you consider the propriety of permitting me to be of some use to you. I am in the habit of assisting ladies in embarrassed circumstances, and nobody knows of it but my steward, who keeps the accounts, and myself. Once more, let me inquire if a little advance of the pecuniary sort, delicately offered, would be acceptable to you?" Grace returned slowly to the chair that she had left. She stood by it, with one hand grasping the top rail, and with her eyes fixed in mocking scrutiny on Lady Janet's face. "At last your ladyship shows your hand," she said. "Hush, money!" "You will send me back to my papers," rejoined Lady Janet. "How obstinate you are!" Grace's hand closed tighter and tighter around the rail of the chair. Without witnesses, without means, without so much as a refuge, thanks to her own coarse cruelties of language and conduct, in the sympathies of others, the sense of her isolation and her helplessness was almost maddening at that final moment. A woman of finer sensibilities would have instantly left the room. Grace's impenetrably hard and narrow mind impelled her to meet the emergency in a very different way. A last base vengeance, to which Lady Janet had voluntarily exposed herself, was still within her reach. "For the present," she thought, "there is but one way of being even with your ladyship. I can cost you as much as possible." "Pray make some allowances for me," she said. "I am not obstinate. I am only a little awkward at matching the audacity of a lady of high rank. I shall improve with practice. I own my language is, as I am painfully aware, only plain English. Permit me to withdraw it, and to substitute yours. What advance is your ladyship, delicately, prepared to offer me?" Lady Janet opened a drawer and took out her cheque-book. The moment of relief had come at last. The only question now left to discuss was evidently the question of amount. Lady Janet considered a little. The question of amount was, to her mind, in some sort, a question of conscience as well. Her love for Mercy, and her loathing for Grace, her horror of seeing her darling degraded and her affection profaned by a public exposure, had hurried her, there was no disputing it, into treating an injured woman harshly. Hateful as Grace Roseberry might be, her father had left her in his last moments, with Lady Janet's full concurrence, to Lady Janet's care. But for Mercy she would have been received at Mablethorpe House as Lady Janet's companion, with a salary of £100 a year. On the other hand, how long, and with such a temper as she had revealed, would Grace have remained in the service of her protectress? She would probably have been dismissed in a few weeks, with a year's salary to compensate her, and with a recommendation to some suitable employment. What would be a fair compensation now? Lady Janet decided that 5 years' salary immediately given, and future assistance rendered if necessary, would represent a fit remembrance of the late Colonel Roseberry's claims, and a liberal pecuniary acknowledgment of any harshness of treatment which Grace might have sustained at her hands. At the same time, and for the further satisfying of her own conscience, she determined to discover the sum which Grace herself would consider sufficient, by the simple process of making Grace herself propose the terms. "It is impossible for me to make you an offer," she said, "for this reason. Your need of money will depend greatly on your future plans. I am quite ignorant of your future plans." "Perhaps your ladyship will kindly advise me," said Grace satirically. "I cannot altogether undertake to advise you," Lady Janet replied. "I can only suppose that you will scarcely remain in England where you have no friends. Whether you go to the law with me or not, you will surely feel the necessity of communicating personally with your friends in Canada. Am I right?" Grace was quite quick enough to understand this as it was meant. Properly interpreted, the answer signified, "If you take your compensation in money, it is understood as part of the bargain that you don't remain in England to annoy me." "Your ladyship is quite right," she said. "I shall certainly not remain in England. I shall consult my friends, and," she added mentally, "go to the law with you afterwards if I possibly can, with your own money." "You will return to Canada," Lady Janet proceeded, "and your prospects there will be, probably, a little uncertain at first. Taking this into consideration, at what amount do you estimate, in your own mind, the pecuniary assistance which you will require?" "May I count on your ladyship's kindness to correct me, if my own ignorant calculations turn out to be wrong?" Grace asked innocently. Here again the words, properly interpreted, had a special signification of their own. "It is stipulated on my part that I put myself up to auction, and that my estimate shall be regulated by your ladyship's highest bid." Thoroughly understanding the stipulation, Lady Janet bowed and waited gravely. Gravely, on her side, Grace began. "I'm afraid I should want more than £100," she said. Lady Janet made her first bid. "I think so too." "More perhaps than 200?" Lady Janet made her second bid. "Probably." "More than 300? 400? 500?" Lady Janet made her highest bid. £500 will do," she said. In spite of herself, Grace's rising color betrayed her ungovernable excitement. From her earliest childhood she had been accustomed to see shillings and sixpences carefully considered before they were parted with. She had never known her father to possess so much as 5 golden sovereigns at his own disposal, unencumbered by debt, in all her experience of him. The atmosphere in which she had lived and breathed was the all-stifling one of genteel poverty. There was something horrible in the greedy eagerness of her eyes as they watched Lady Janet, to see if she was really sufficiently in earnest to give away £500 sterling with a stroke of her pen. Lady Janet wrote the cheque in a few seconds, and pushed it across the table. Grace's hungry eyes devoured the golden line. "Pay to myself or bearer £500," and verified the signature beneath, Janet Roy. Once sure of the money, whenever she chose to take it, the native meanness of her nature instantly asserted itself. She tossed her head and let the cheque lie on the table, with an overacted appearance of caring very little whether she took it or not. "Your ladyship is not to suppose that I snap at your cheque," she said. Lady Janet leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The very sight of Grace Roseberry sickened her. Her mind filled suddenly of the image of Mercy. She longed to feast her eyes again on that grand beauty, to fill her ears again with the melody of that gentle voice. "I require time to consider, in justice to my own self-respect," Grace went on. Lady Janet wearily made a sign, granting time to consider. "Your ladyship's boudoir is, I presume, still at my disposal?" Lady Janet silently granted the boudoir. "And your ladyship's servants are at my orders, if I have occasion to employ them?" Lady Janet suddenly opened her eyes. "The whole household is at your orders!" she cried furiously. "Leave me!" Grace was far from being offended. If anything, she was gratified. There was a certain triumph in having stung Lady Janet into an open outbreak of temper. She insisted forthwith on another condition. "In the event of my deciding to receive the cheque," she said, "I cannot, consistently with my own self-respect, permit it to be delivered to me otherwise than enclosed. Your ladyship will, if necessary, be so kind as to enclose it. Good evening." She sauntered to the door, looking from side to side with an air of supreme disparagement at the priceless treasures of art which adorned the walls. Her eyes dropped superciliously on the carpet, the design of a famous French painter, as if her feet condescended in walking over it. The audacity with which she had entered the room had been marked enough. It shrank to nothing before the infinitely superior proportions of the insolence with which she left it. The instant the door was closed, Lady Janet rose from her chair. Reckless of the wintry chill in the outer air, she threw open one of the windows. "Pah!" she exclaimed with a shudder of disgust. "The very air of the room is tainted by her." She returned to her chair. Her mood changed as she sat down again. Her heart was with Mercy once more. "Oh, my love!" she murmured. "How low I have stooped! How miserably I have degraded myself! And all for you!" The bitterness of the retrospect was unendurable. The inbred force of the woman's nature took refuge from it in an outburst of defiance and despair. "Whatever she has done, that wretch deserves it. Not a living creature in this house shall say she has deceived me. She has not deceived me. She loves me. What do I care whether she has given me her true name or not? She has given me her true heart. What right had Julian to play upon her feelings and pry into her secrets? My poor, tempted, tortured child! I won't hear her confession. Not another word shall she say to any living creature. I am mistress. I will forbid it at once." She snatched a sheet of notepaper from the case, hesitated, and threw it from her on the table. "Why not send for my darling?" she thought. "Why write?" She hesitated once more, and resigned the idea. "No, I can't trust myself. I daren't see her yet." She took up the sheet of paper again and wrote her second message to Mercy. This time the note began fondly, with a familiar form of address. "My dear child, I have had time to think and compose myself a little since I last wrote, requesting you to defer the explanation which you had promised me. I already understand and appreciate the motives which led you to interfere as you did downstairs, and I now ask you to entirely abandon this explanation. It will, I am sure, be painful to you, for reasons of your own into which I have no wish to inquire, to produce the person of whom you spoke. And as you know already, I myself am weary of hearing of her. Besides, there is really no need now for you to explain anything. The stranger, whose visits here have caused us so much pain and anxiety, will trouble us no more. She leaves England of her own free will, after a conversation with me, which has perfectly succeeded in composing and satisfying her. Not a word more, my dear, to me, or to my nephew, or to any other human creature, of what has happened in the dining-room to-day. When we next meet, let it be understood between us that the past is henceforth and forever buried to oblivion. This is not only the earnest request, it is, if necessary, the positive command, of your mother and friend, Janet Roy. P.S. I shall find opportunities, before you leave your room, of speaking separately to my nephew and to Horace Holmcroft. You need dread no embarrassment when you next meet them. I will not ask you to answer my note in writing. Say yes to the maid who will bring it to you, and I shall know we understand each other." After sealing the envelope which enclosed these lines, Lady Janet addressed it, as usual, to Miss Grace Roseberry. She was just rising to ring the bell when the maid appeared with a message from the boudoir. The woman's tones and looks showed plainly that she had been made the object of Grace's insolent self-assertion, as well as her mistress. "If you please, my lady, the person downstairs wishes—" Lady Janet, frowning contemptuously, interrupted the message at the outset. "I know what the person downstairs wishes. She has sent you for a letter from me?" "Yes, my lady." "Anything more?" "She has sent one of the men servants, my lady, for a cab. If your ladyship had only heard how she spoke to him!" Lady Janet intimated by a sign that she would rather not hear. She at once enclosed the cheque in an undirected envelope. "Take that to her," she said, "and then come back to me." Dismissing Grace Roseberry from all further consideration, Lady Janet sat with her letter to Mercy in her hand, reflecting on her position, and on the efforts which it might still demand from her. Pursuing this train of thought, it now occurred to her that accident might bring Horace and Mercy together at any moment, and that, in Horace's present frame of mind, he would certainly insist on the very explanation which it was the foremost interest of her life to suppress. The dread of this disaster was in full possession of her when the maid returned. "Where is Mr. Holmcroft?" she asked, the moment the woman entered the room. "I saw him open the library door, my lady, just now, on my way upstairs." "Was he alone?" "Yes, my lady." "Go to him, and say I want to see him here immediately." The maid withdrew on her second errand. Lady Janet rose restlessly, and closed the open window. Her impatient desire to make sure of Horace so completely mastered her that she left her room, and met the woman in the corridor on her return. Receiving Horace's message of excuse, she instantly sent back the peremptory rejoinder: "Say that he will oblige me to go to him if he persists in refusing to come to me. And stay," she added, remembering the undelivered letter, "send Miss Roseberry's maid here. I want her." Left alone again, Lady Janet paced once or twice up and down the corridor, then grew suddenly weary of the sight of it, and went back to her room. The two maids returned together. One of them, having announced Horace's submission, was dismissed. The other was sent to Mercy's room with Lady Janet's letter. In a minute or two the messenger appeared again, with the news that she had found the room empty. "Have you any idea where Miss Roseberry is?" "No, my lady." Lady Janet reflected for a moment. If Horace presented himself without any needless delay, the plain inference would be that she had succeeded in separating him from Mercy. If his appearance was suspiciously deferred, she decided on personally searching for Mercy in the reception rooms on the lower floor of the house. "What have you done with the letter?" she asked. "I left it on Miss Roseberry's table, my lady." "Very well. Keep within hearing of the bell in case I want you again." Another minute brought Lady Janet's suspense to an end. She heard the welcome sound of a knock at her door from a man's hand. Horace hurriedly entered the room. "What is it you want with me, Lady Janet?" he inquired, not very graciously. "Sit down, Horace, and you shall hear." Horace did not accept the invitation. "Excuse me," he said, "if I mention that I'm rather in a hurry." "Why are you in a hurry?" "I have reasons for wishing to see Grace as soon as possible." "And I have reasons," Lady Janet rejoined, "for wishing to speak to you about Grace before you see her. Serious reasons. Sit down." Horace started. "Serious reasons?" he repeated. "You surprise me." "I shall surprise you still more before I have done." Their eyes met as Lady Janet answered in those terms. Horace observed signs of agitation in her which he now noticed for the first time. His face darkened with an expression of sullen distrust, and he took the chair in silence. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of the New Magdalen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The New Magdalen by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 24. Lady Janet's Letter. The narrative leaves Lady Janet and Horace Holmcroft together and returns to Julian and Mercy in the library. An interval passed, a long interval, measured by the impatient reckoning of suspense, after the cab which had taken Grace Roseberry away had left the house. The minutes followed each other, and still the warning sound of Horace's footsteps was not heard on the marble pavement of the hall. By common, though unexpressed, consent, Julian and Mercy avoided touching upon the one subject on which they were now both interested alike. With their thoughts fixed secretly in vain speculation on the nature of the interview which was then taking place in Lady Janet's room, they tried to speak on topics indifferent to both of them, tried and failed, and tried again. In a last and longest pause of silence between them, the next event happened. The door from the hall was softly and suddenly opened. Was it Horace? No, not even yet. The person who had opened the door was only Mercy's maid. "My lady's love, miss, and will you please to read this directly?" Giving her message in those terms, the woman produced from the pocket of her apron Lady Janet's second letter to Mercy, with a strip of paper oddly pinned round the envelope. Mercy detached the paper and found on the inner side some lines in pencil, hurriedly written in Lady Janet's hand. They ran thus: "Don't lose a moment in reading my letter, and mind this, when age returns to you, meet him firmly, say nothing." Enlightened by the warning words which Julian had spoken to her, Mercy was at no loss to place the right interpretation on those strange lines. Instead of immediately opening the letter, she stopped the maid at the library door. Julian's suspicion of the most trifling events that were taking place in the house had found its way from his mind to hers. "Wait," she said. "I don't understand what is going on upstairs. I want to ask you something." The woman came back, not very willingly. "How did you know I was here?" Mercy inquired. "If you please, miss, her ladyship ordered me to take the letter to you some little time since. You were not in your room, and I left it on your table." "I understand that, but how came you to bring the letter here?" "My lady rang for me, miss. Before I could knock at her door, she came out into the corridor with that morsel of paper in her hand, so as to keep you from entering her room." "Yes, miss. Her ladyship wrote on the paper in a great hurry, and told me to pin it round the letter that I had left in your room. I was to take them both together to you, and to let nobody see me, You will find Miss Roseberry in the library, her ladyship says. And run, 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 there isn't a moment to lose. Those were her own words, miss. Did you hear anything in the room before Lady Janet came out and met you? The woman hesitated and looked at Julian. I hardly know whether I ought to tell you, miss. Julian turned away to leave the library. Mercy stopped him by a motion of her hand. You know that I shall not get you into any trouble, she said to the maid, and you may speak quite safely before Mr. Julian Gray. Thus reassured, the maid spoke. To own the truth, miss, I heard Mr. Holmcroft in my lady's room. His voice sounded as if he was angry. I may say they were both angry, Mr. Holmcroft and my lady. She turned to Julian. And just before her ladyship came out, sir, I heard your name, as if it was you they were having words about. I can't say exactly what it was. I hadn't time to hear. And I didn't listen, miss. The door was ajar, and the voices were so loud nobody could help hearing them. It was useless to detain the woman any longer. Having given her leave to withdraw, Mercy turned to Julian. Why were they quarrelling about you? She asked. Julian pointed to the unopened letter in her hand. The answer to your question may be there, he said. Read the letter while you have the chance, and if I can advise you, say so at once. With a strange reluctance, she opened the envelope. With a sinking heart, she read the lines in which Lady Janet, as mother and friend, commanded her absolutely to suppress the confession which she had pledged herself to make in the sacred interests of justice and truth. A low cry of despair escaped her as the cruel complication in her position revealed itself in all its unmerited hardship. Oh, Lady Janet, she thought, there was but one trial more left in my hard lot, and it comes to me from you. She handed the letter to Julian. He took it from her in silence. His pale complexion turned paler still as he read it. His eyes rested on her compassionately as he handed it back. To my mind, he said, Lady Janet herself sets all further doubt at rest. Her letter tells me what she wanted when she sent for Horace, and why my name was mentioned between them. Tell me, cried Mercy eagerly. He did not immediately answer her. He sat down again in the chair by her side and pointed to the letter. Has Lady Janet shaken your resolution? He asked. She has strengthened my resolution, Mercy answered. She has added a new bitterness to my remorse. She did not mean it harshly, but the reply sounded harshly in Julian's ears. It stirred the generous impulses which were the strongest impulses in his nature. He who had once pleaded with Mercy for compassionate consideration for herself, now pleaded with her for compassionate consideration for Lady Janet. With persuasive gentleness he drew a little nearer, and laid his hand on her arm. Don't judge her harshly, he said. She's wrong, miserably wrong. She has recklessly degraded herself. She has recklessly tempted you. Still, is it generous, is it even just to hold her responsible for deliberate sin? She's at the close of her days. She can feel no new affection. She can never replace you. View her position in that light, and you will see, as I see, that it is no base motive which has led her astray. Think of her wounded heart and her wasted life, and say to yourself forgivingly, she loves me. Mercy's eyes filled with tears. I do say it, she answered. Not forgivingly. It is I who have need of forgiveness. I say it gratefully when I think of her. I say it with shame and sorrow when I think of myself. He took her hand for the first time. He guiltlessly looked, at her downcast face. He spoke as he had spoken at the memorable interview between them, which had made a new woman of her. I can imagine no cruel trial, he said, than the trial that is now before you. The benefactress to whom you owe everything asks nothing from you but your silence. The person whom you have wronged is no longer present to stimulate your resolution to speak. Horace himself, unless I am entirely mistaken, will not hold you to the explanation that you have promised. The temptation to keep your false position in this house is, I do not scruple to say, all but irresistible. Sister and friend, can you still justify my faith in you? Will you still own the truth without the base fear of discovery to drive you to it?" She lifted her head, with the steady light of resolution shining again in her grand grey eyes. Her low, sweet voice answered him without a faltering note in it. "I will. You will do justice to the woman whom you have wronged, unworthy as she is, powerless as she is to expose you. I will. You will sacrifice everything you have gained by the fraud to the sacred duty of atonement. You will suffer anything, even though you offend the second mother who has loved you and sinned for you, rather than suffer the degradation of yourself?" Her hand closed firmly on his. Again and for the last time she answered, "I will." His voice had not trembled yet. It failed him now. His next words were spoken in faint, whispering tones, to himself, not to her. "Thank God for this day," he said. "I have been of some service to one of the noblest of God's creatures." Some subtle influence, as he spoke, passed from his hand to hers. It trembled through her nerves, it entwined itself mysteriously with the finest sensibilities in her nature. It softly opened her heart to a first vague surmising of the devotion that she had inspired in him. A faint glow of colour, lovely in its faintness, stole over her face and neck. Her breathing quickened tremblingly. She drew her hand away from him, and sighed when she had released it. He rose suddenly to his feet, and left her, without a word or a look, walking slowly down the length of the room. When he turned and came back to her, his face was composed. He was master of himself again. Mercy was the first to speak. She turned the conversation from herself by reverting to the proceedings in Lady Janet's room. "You spoke of Horace just now," she said, "in terms which surprised me. You appeared to think that he would not hold me to my explanation. Is that one of the conclusions which you draw from Lady Janet's letter?" "Most assuredly," Julian answered. "You will see the conclusion as I see it, if we return for a moment to Grace Roseberry's departure from the house." Mercy interrupted him there. "Can you guess," she asked, "how Lady Janet prevailed upon her to go?" "I hardly like to own it," said Julian. "There is an expression in the letter which suggests to me that Lady Janet has offered her money, and that she has taken the bribe." "Oh, I can't think that." "Let us return to Horace. Miss Roseberry wants out of the house, but one serious obstacle is left in Lady Janet's way. That obstacle is Horace Holmcroft." "How is Horace an obstacle?" "He is an obstacle in this sense. He is under an engagement to marry you in a week's time, and Lady Janet is determined to keep him, as she is determined to keep everyone else, in ignorance of the truth. She will do that without scruple. But the inbred sense of honor in her is not utterly silenced yet. She cannot, she dare not, let Horace make you his wife under the false impression that you are Colonel Roseberry's daughter. You see the situation? On the one hand, she won't enlighten him. On the other hand, she cannot allow him to marry you blindfold. In this emergency, what is she to do? There is but one alternative that I can discover. She must persuade Horace, or she must irritate Horace, into acting for himself, and breaking off the engagement on his own responsibility." Mercy stopped him. "Impossible!" she cried, warmly. "Impossible!" "Look again at her letter," Julian rejoined. "It tells you, plainly, that you need fear no embarrassment when you next meet Horace. If words mean anything, those words mean that he will not claim from you the confidence which you have promised to repose in him. On what condition is it possible for him to abstain from doing that? On the one condition that you have ceased to represent the first and foremost interest of his life." Mercy still held firm. "You are wronging Lady Janet," she said. Julian smiled sadly. "Try to look at it," he answered, "from Lady Janet's point of view. Do you suppose she sees anything derogatory to her in attempting to break off the marriage? I will answer for it, she believes she is doing you a kindness. In one sense it would be a kindness, to spare you the shame of a humiliating confession, and to save you, possibly, from being rejected to your face by the man you love. In my opinion, the thing is done already. I have reasons of my own for believing that my aunt will succeed far more easily than she could anticipate. Horace's temper will help her." Mercy's mind began to yield to him, in spite of herself. "What do you mean by Horace's temper?" she inquired. "Must you ask me that?" he said, drawing back a little from her. "I must." "I mean by Horace's temper, Horace's unworthy distrust of the interest that I feel in you." She instantly understood him, and more than that, she secretly admired him for the scrupulous delicacy with which he had expressed himself. Another man would not have thought of sparing her in that way. Another man would have said plainly, "Horace is jealous of me." Julian did not wait for her to answer him. He considerately went on. "For the reason that I have just mentioned," he said, "Horace will be easily irritated into taking a course which, in his calmer moments, nothing would induce him to adopt. Until I heard what your maid said to you, I had thought, for your sake, of retiring before he joined you here. Now I know that my name has been introduced, and has made mischief upstairs, I feel the necessity, for your sake again, of meeting Horace and his temper face to face before you see him. Let me, if I can, prepare him to hear you without any angry feeling in his mind toward you. Do you object to retire to the next room for a few minutes, in the event of his coming back to the library?" Mercy's courage instantly rose with the emergency. She refused to leave the two men together. "Don't think me insensible to your kindness," she said. "If I leave you with Horace, I may expose you to insult. I refuse to do that. What makes you doubt his coming back?" "His prolonged absence makes me doubt it," Julian replied. "In my belief, the marriage is broken off. He may go as Grace Roseberry has gone. You may never see him again." The instant the opinion was uttered, it was practically contradicted by the man himself. Horace opened the library door. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of The New Magdalen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The New Magdalen by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 25. The Confession. He stopped just inside the door. His first look was for Mercy. His second look was for Julian. "I knew it," he said, with an assumption of sardonic composure. "If I could only have persuaded Lady Janet to bet, I should have won £100. He advanced to Julian with a sudden change from irony to anger. "Would you like to hear what the bet was?" he asked. "I should prefer seeing you able to control yourself in the presence of this lady," Julian answered quietly. "I offered to lay Lady Janet £200 to 1," Horace proceeded, "that I should find you here making love to Miss Roseberry behind my back." Mercy interfered before Julian could reply. "If you cannot speak without insulting one of us," she said, "permit me to request that you will not address yourself to Mr. Julian Gray." Horace bowed to her with a mockery of respect. "Pray don't alarm yourself. I am pledged to be scrupulously civil to both of you," he said. "Lady Janet only allowed me to leave her on condition of my promising to behave with perfect politeness. What else can I do? I have two privileged people to deal with, a parson and a woman. The parson's profession protects him, and the woman's sex protects her. You have got me at a disadvantage, and you both of you know it. I beg to apologize if I have forgotten the clergyman's profession and the lady's sex." "You have forgotten more than that," said Julian. "You have forgotten that you were born a gentleman and bred a man of honor. So far as I am concerned, I don't ask you to remember that I am a clergyman. I obtrude my profession on nobody. I only ask you to remember your birth and your breeding. It is quite bad enough to cruelly and unjustly suspect an old friend, who has never forgotten what he owes to you and to himself. But it is still more unworthy of you to acknowledge those suspicions in the hearing of a woman whom your own choice has doubly bound you to respect." He stopped. The two eyed each other for a moment in silence. It was impossible for Mercy to look at them, as she was looking now, without drawing the inevitable comparison between the manly force and dignity of Julian and the womanish malice and irritability of Horace. A last faithful impulse of loyalty toward the man to whom she had been betrothed impelled her to part them, before Horace had hopelessly degraded himself in her estimation by contrast with Julian. "You had better wait to speak to me," she said to him, "until we are alone." "Certainly," Horace answered with a sneer, "if Mr. Julian Gray will permit it." Mercy turned to Julian with a look which said plainly, "Pity us both and leave us." "Do you wish me to go?" he asked. "Add to all your other kindnesses to me," she answered. "Wait for me in that room." She pointed to the door that led into the dining room. Julian hesitated. "You promise to let me know it if I can be of the smallest service to you?" he said. "Yes, yes." She followed him as he withdrew, and added rapidly in a whisper, "Leave the door ajar." He made no answer. As she returned to Horace, he entered the dining room. The one concession he could make to her he did make. He closed the door so noiselessly that not even her quick hearing could detect that he had shut it. Mercy spoke to Horace without waiting to let him speak first. "I have promised you an explanation of my conduct," she said, in accents that trembled a little in spite of herself. "I am ready to perform my promise." "I have a question to ask you before you do that," he rejoined. "Can you speak the truth?" "I am waiting to speak the truth." "I will give you an opportunity. Are you, or are you not, in love with Julian Gray?" "You ought to be ashamed to ask the question." "Is that your only answer?" "I have never been unfaithful to you, Horace, even in thought. If I had not been true to you, should I feel my position as you see I feel it now?" He smiled bitterly. "I have my own opinion of your fidelity and of his honor," he said. "You couldn't even send him into the next room without whispering to him first. Never mind that now. At least you know that Julian Gray is in love with you." "Mr. Julian Gray has never breathed a word of it to me." A man can show a woman that he loves her without saying it in words." Mercy's power of endurance began to fail her. Not even Grace Roseberry had spoken more insultingly to her of Julian than Horace was speaking now. "Whoever says that of Mr. Julian Gray lies," she answered warmly. "Then Lady Janet lies," Horace retorted. "Lady Janet never said it. Lady Janet is incapable of saying it." "She may not have said it in so many words, but she never denied it when I said it. I reminded her of the time when Julian Gray first heard from me that I was going to marry you. He was so overwhelmed that he was barely capable of being civil to me. Lady Janet was present, and could not deny it. I asked her if she had observed since then signs of a confidential understanding between you two. She could not deny the signs. I asked if she had ever found you two together. She could not deny that she had found you two together this very day, under circumstances which justified suspicion. Yes, yes, look as angry as you like. You don't know what has been going on upstairs. Lady Janet is bent on breaking off our engagement, and Julian Gray is at the bottom of it." As to Julian, Horace was utterly wrong. But as to Lady Janet, he echoed the warning words which Julian himself had spoken to Mercy. She was staggered, but she still held to her own opinion. "I don't believe it," she said firmly. He advanced a step, and fixed his angry eyes on her searchingly. "Do you know why Lady Janet sent for me?" he asked. "No." "Then I will tell you. Lady Janet is a staunch friend of yours, there is no denying that. She wished to inform me that she had altered her mind about your promised explanation of your conduct. She said, 'Reflection has convinced me that no explanation is required. I have laid my positive commands on my adopted daughter that no explanation shall take place.' Has she done that?" "Yes." "Now observe. I waited till she had finished, and then I said, 'What have I to do with this?' Lady Janet has one merit, she speaks out." "You are to do as I do," she answered. "You are to consider that no explanation is required, and you are to consign the whole matter to oblivion from this time forth." "Are you serious?" I asked. "Quite serious." "In that case, I have to inform your ladyship that you insist on more than you may suppose. You insist on my breaking my engagement to Miss Roseberry. Either I am to have the explanation that she has promised me, or I refuse to marry her. How do you think Lady Janet took that? She shut up her lips, and she spread out her hands, and she looked at me as much as to say, 'Just as you please. Refuse if you like. It's nothing to me.'" He paused for a moment. Mercy remained silent on her side. She foresaw what was coming. Mistaken in supposing that Horace had left the house, Julian had, beyond all doubt, been equally in error in concluding that he had been entrapped into breaking off the engagement upstairs. "Do you understand me so far?" Horace asked. "I understand you perfectly." "I will not trouble you much longer," he resumed. "I said to Lady Janet, 'Be so good as to answer me in plain words. Do you still insist on closing Miss Roseberry's lips?' 'I still insist,' she answered. 'No explanation is required. if you are base enough to suspect your betrothed wife, I am just enough to believe in my adopted daughter." I replied, and I beg you will give your best attention to what I am now going to say. I replied to that, "It is not fair to charge me with suspecting her. I don't understand her confidential relations with Julian Gray, and I don't understand her language and conduct in the presence of the police officer. I claim it as my right to be satisfied on both those points in the character of the man who is to marry her." There was my answer. I spare you all that followed. I only repeat what I said to Lady Janet. She has commanded you to be silent. If you obey her commands, I owe it to myself, and I owe it to my family, to release you from your engagement. Choose between your duty to Lady Janet and your duty to me." He had mastered his temper at last. He spoke with dignity, and he spoke to the point. His position was unassailable. He claimed nothing but his right. "My choice was made," Mercy answered, "when I gave you my promise upstairs." She waited a little, struggling to control herself on the brink of the terrible revelation that was coming. Her eyes dropped before his. Her heart beat faster and faster. But she struggled bravely. With a desperate courage she faced the position. "If you are ready to listen," she went on, "I am ready to tell you why I insisted on having the police officer sent out of the house." Horace held up his hand warningly. "Stop!" he said. "That is not all." His infatuated jealousy of Julian, fatally misinterpreting her agitation, distrusted her at the very outset. She had limited herself to clearing up the one question of her interference with the officer of justice. The other question, of her relations with Julian, she had deliberately passed over. Horace instantly drew his own ungenerous conclusion. "Let us not misunderstand one another," he said. "The explanation of your conduct in the other room is only one of the explanations which you owe me. You have something else to account for. Let us begin with that, if you please." She looked at him in unaffected surprise. "What else have I to account for?" she asked. He again repeated his reply to Lady Janet. "I have told you already," he said. "I don't understand your confidential relations with Julian Gray." Mercy's colour rose. Mercy's eyes began to brighten. "Don't return to that!" she cried, with an irrepressible outbreak of disgust. "Don't, for God's sake, make me despise you at such a moment as this." His obstinacy only gathered fresh encouragement from that appeal to his better sense. "I insist on returning to it." She had resolved to bear anything from him, as her fit punishment for the deception of which she had been guilty. But it was not in womanhood, at the moment when the first words of her confession were trembling on her lips, to endure Horace's unworthy suspicion of her. She rose from her seat and met his eyes firmly. "I refuse to degrade myself, and to degrade Mr. Julian Gray, by answering you," she said. "Consider what you are doing," he rejoined. "Change your mind before it is too late." "You have had my reply." Those resolute words, that steady resistance, seemed to infuriate him. He caught her roughly by the arm. "You are as false as hell!" he cried. "It's all over between you and me." The loud, threatening tone in which he had spoken penetrated through the closed door of the dining room. The door instantly opened. Julian returned to the library. He had just set foot in the room when there was a knock at the other door, the door that opened on the hall. One of the men servants appeared with a telegraphic message in his hand. Mercy was the first to see it. It was the matron's answer to the letter which she had sent to the Refuge. "For Mr. Julian Gray?" she asked. "Yes, miss." "Give it to me." She signed to the man to withdraw, and herself gave the telegram to Julian. "It is addressed to you at my request," she said. "You will recognize the name of the person who sends it, and you will find a message in it for me." Horace interfered before Julian could open the telegram. "Another private understanding between you," he said. "Give me that telegram." Julian looked at him with quiet contempt. "It is directed to me," he answered, and opened the envelope. The message inside was expressed in these terms: "I am as deeply interested in her as you are. Say that I have received her letter, and that I welcome her back to the Refuge with all my heart. I have business this evening in the neighbourhood. I will call for her myself at Mablethorpe House." The message explained itself. Of her own free will she had made the expiation complete. Of her own free will she was going back to the martyrdom of her old life. Bound as he knew himself to be to let no compromising word or action escape him in the presence of Horace, the irrepressible expression of Julian's admiration glowed in his eyes as they rested on Mercy. Horace detected the look. He sprang forward and tried to snatch the telegram out of Julian's hand. "Give it to me," he said. "I will have it." Julian silently put him back at arm's length. Maddened with rage, he lifted his hand threateningly. "Give it to me," he repeated between his set teeth, "or it'll be the worse for you." "Give it to me," said Mercy, suddenly placing herself between them. Julian gave it. She turned and offered it to Horace, looking at him with a steady eye, holding it out to him with a steady hand. "Read it," she said. Julian's generous nature pitied the man who had insulted him. Julian's great heart only remembered the friend of former times. "Spare him," he said to Mercy. "Remember, he is unprepared." She neither answered nor moved. Nothing stirred the horrible torpor of her resignation to her fate. She knew that the time had come. Julian appealed to Horace. "Don't read it," he cried. "Hear what she has to say to you first." Horace's hand answered him with a contemptuous gesture. Horace's eyes devoured word by word the matron's message. He looked up when he had read it through. There was a ghastly change in his face as he turned it on Mercy. She stood between the two men like a statue. The life in her seemed to have died out, except in her eyes. Her eyes rested on Horace with a steady, glittering calmness. The silence was only broken by the low murmuring of Julian's voice. His face was hidden in his hands. He was praying for them. Horace spoke, laying his finger on the telegram. His voice had changed with the change in his face. The tone was low and trembling. No one would have recognized it as the tone of Horace's voice. "What does this mean?" he said to Mercy. "It can't be for you." It is for me. What have you to do with a refuge?" Without a change in her face, without a movement in her limbs, she spoke the fatal words. "I have come from a refuge, and I am going back to a refuge. Mr. Horace Holmcroft, I am Mercy Merrick." End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the New Magdalen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The New Magdalen by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 26. Great Heart and Little Heart. There was a pause. The moments passed, and not one of the three moved. The moments passed, and not one of the three spoke. Insensibly the words of supplication died away on Julian's lips. Even his energy failed to sustain him, tried as it was now by the crushing oppression of suspense. The first trifling movement which suggested the idea of change, and which so brought with it the first vague sense of relief, came from Mercy. Incapable of sustaining the prolonged effort of standing, she drew back a little and took a chair. No outward manifestation of emotion escaped her. There she sat, with the death-like torpor of resignation in her face, waiting her sentence in silence from the man at whom she had hurled the whole terrible confession of the truth in one sentence. Julian lifted his head as she moved. He looked at Horace, and advancing a few steps, looked again. There was fear in his face as he suddenly turned it toward Mercy. "Speak to him," he said in a whisper. "Rouse him before it's too late." She moved mechanically in her chair. She looked mechanically at Julian. "What more have I to say to him?" she asked in faint, weary tones. "Did I not tell him everything when I told him my name?" The natural sound of her voice might have failed to affect Horace. The altered sound of it roused him. He approached Mercy's chair with a dull surprise in his face, and put his hand in a weak, wavering way on her shoulder. In that position he stood for a while, looking down at her in silence. The one idea in him that found its way outward to expression was the idea of Julian. Without moving his hand, without looking up from Mercy, he spoke for the first time since the shock had fallen on him. "Where is Julian?" he asked very quietly. "I am here, Horace, close by you." "Will you do me a service?" "Certainly. How can I help you?" He considered a little before he replied. His hand left Mercy's shoulder and went up to his head, then dropped at his side. His next words were spoken in a sadly helpless, bewildered way. "I have an idea, Julian, that I have been somehow to blame. I said some hard words to you. It was a little while since. I don't clearly remember what it was all about. My temper has been a good deal tried in this house. I have never been used to the sort of thing that goes on here. Secrets and mysteries, and hateful low-lived quarrels. We have no secrets and mysteries at home, and as for quarrels, ridiculous. My mother and my sisters are highly bred women. You know them. Gentlewomen in the best sense of the word. When I'm with them I have no anxieties. I'm not harassed at home by doubts of who people are, and confusion about names and so on. I suspect the contrast weighs a little on my mind and upsets it. They make me over suspicious among them here, and it ends in my feeling doubts and fears that I can't get over. Doubts about you, and fears about myself. I have got a fear about myself now. I want you to help me. Shall I make an apology first?" "Don't say a word. Tell me what I can do." He turned his face toward Julian for the first time. "Just look at me," he said. "Does it strike you that I am at all wrong in my mind? Tell me the truth, old fellow." "Your nerves are a little shaken, Horace, nothing more." He considered again after that reply, his eyes remaining anxiously fixed on Julian's face. "My nerves are a little shaken," he repeated. "That is true. I feel they are shaken. I should like, if you don't mind, to make sure that it's no worse. Will you help me to try if my memory is all right? I will do anything you like." "Ah, you are a good fellow, Julian, and a clear-headed fellow too, which is very important just now. Look here, I say it's about a week since the troubles began in this house. Do you say so too?" "Yes." "The troubles came in with the coming of a woman from Germany, a stranger to us, who behaved very violently in the dining room there. Am I right so far?" "Quite right." "The woman carried matters with a high hand. She claimed Colonel Roseberry I wish to be strictly accurate she claimed the late Colonel Roseberry as her father. She told a tiresome story about her having been robbed of her papers and her name by an impostor who had personated her. She said the name of the impostor was Mercy Merrick, and she afterward put the climax to it all. She pointed to the lady who is engaged to be my wife, and declared that she was Mercy Merrick. Tell me again, is that right or wrong?" Julian answered him as before. He went on, speaking more confidently and more excitedly than he had spoken yet. "Now attend to this, Julian. I'm going to pass from my memory of what happened a week ago to my memory of what happened 5 minutes since. You were present. I want to know if you heard it too." He paused, and without taking his eyes off Julian, pointed backward to Mercy. "There is the lady who is engaged to marry me," he resumed. "Did I or did I not hear her say that she had come out of a refuge, and that she was going back to a refuge? Did I or did I not hear her own to my face that her name was Mercy Merrick? Answer me, Julian, my good friend, answer me, for the sake of old times." His voice faltered as he spoke those imploring words. Under the dull blank of his face there appeared the first signs of emotion, slowly forcing its way outward. The stunned mind was reviving faintly. Julian saw his opportunity of aiding the recovery, and seized it. He took Horace gently by the arm, and pointed to Mercy. "There is your answer," he said. "Look and pity her." She had not once interrupted them while they had been speaking. She had changed her position again, and that was all. There was a writing table at the side of her chair. Her outstretched arms rested on it. Her head had dropped on her arms, and her face was hidden. Julian's judgment had not misled him. The utter self-abandonment of her attitude answered Horace as no human language could have answered him. He looked at her. A quick spasm of pain passed across his face. He turned once more to the faithful friend who had forgiven him. His head fell on Julian's shoulder, and he burst into tears. Mercy started wildly to her feet, and looked at the two men. "Oh God!" she cried, "what have I done?" Julian quieted her by a motion of his hand. "You have helped me to save him," he said. "Let his tears have their way. Wait." He put one arm round Horace to support him. The manly tenderness of the action, the complete and noble pardon of past injuries which it implied, touched Mercy to the heart. She went back to her chair. Again shame and sorrow overpowered her, and again she hid her face from view. Julian led Horace to a seat, and silently waited by him until he had recovered his self-control. He gratefully took the kind hand that had sustained him. He said simply, almost boyishly, "Thank you, Julian. I am better now." "Are you composed enough to listen to what is said to you?" Julian asked. "Yes. Do you wish to speak to me?" Julian left him without immediately replying, and returned to Mercy. "The time has come," he said. "Tell him all, truly, unreservedly, as you would tell it to me." She shuddered as he spoke. "Have I not told him enough?" she asked. "Do you want me to break his heart? Look at him. Look what I have done already." Horace shrank from the ordeal as Mercy shrank from it. "No, no, I can't listen to it. I daren't listen to it," he cried, and rose to leave the room. Julian had taken the good work in hand. He never faltered over it for an instant. Horace had loved her. How dearly, Julian now knew for the first time. The bare possibility that she might earn her pardon if she was allowed to plead her own cause was a possibility still left. To let her win on Horace to forgive her was death to the love that still filled his heart in secret. But he never hesitated. With a resolution which the weaker man was powerless to resist, he took him by the arm and led him back to his place. "For her sake, and for your sake, you shall not condemn her unheard," he said to Horace firmly. "One temptation to deceive you after another has tried her, and she has resisted them all. With no discovery to fear, with a letter from the benefactress who loves her commanding her to be silent, with everything that a woman values in this world to lose if she owns what she has done, this woman, for the truth's sake, has spoken the truth. Does she deserve nothing at your hands in return for that? Respect her, Horace, and hear her." Horace yielded. Julian turned to Mercy. "You have allowed me to guide you so far," he said. "Will you allow me to guide you still?" Her eyes sank before his. Her bosom rose and fell. His influence over her maintained its sway. She bowed her head in speechless submission. "Tell him," Julian proceeded, in accents of entreaty, not of command, "tell him what your life has been. Tell him how you were tried and tempted, with no friend near to speak the words which might have saved you. And then," he added, raising her from the chair, "let him judge you if he can." He attempted to lead her across the room to the place which Horace occupied, but her submission had its limits. Half way to the place she stopped, and refused to go further. Julian offered her a chair. She declined to take it. Standing with one hand on the back of the chair, she waited for the word from Horace which would permit her to speak. She was resigned to the ordeal. Her face was calm, her mind was clear. The hardest of all humiliations to endure, the humiliation of acknowledging her name, she had passed through. Nothing remained but to show her gratitude to Julian by acceding to his wishes, and to ask pardon of Horace before they parted for ever. In a little while the matron would arrive at the house, and then it would be over. Unwillingly Horace looked at her. Their eyes met. He broke out suddenly with something of his former violence. "I can't realize it even now," he cried. "Is it true that you are not Grace Roseberry? Don't look at me. Say in one word yes or no." She answered him humbly and sadly, "Yes." "You have done what that woman accused you of doing? Am I to believe that?" "You are to believe it, sir." All the weakness of Horace's character disclosed itself when she made that reply. "Infamous!" he exclaimed. "What excuse can you make for the cruel deception you have practiced on me? Too bad! Too bad! There can be no excuse for you." She accepted his reproaches with unshaken resignation. "I have deserved it," was all she said to herself. "I have deserved it." Julian interposed once more in Mercy's defense. "Wait till you are sure there is no excuse for her, Horace," he said quietly. "Grant her justice, if you can grant no more. I leave you together." He advanced toward the door of the dining room. Horace's weakness disclosed itself once more. "Don't leave me alone with her!" he burst out. "The misery of it is more than I can bear." Julian looked at Mercy. Her face brightened faintly. The momentary expression of relief told him how truly he would be befriending her if he consented to remain in the room. A position of retirement was offered to him by a recess formed by the central bay window of the library. If he occupied this place, they could see or not see that he was present, as their own inclinations might decide them. "I will stay with you, Horace, as long as you wish me to be here." Having answered in those terms, he stopped as he passed Mercy on his way to the window. His quick and kindly insight told him that he might still be of some service to her. A hint from him might show her the shortest and the easiest way of making her confession. Delicately and briefly he gave her the hint. "The first time I met you, I saw that your life had had its troubles. Let us hear how those troubles began." He withdrew to his place in the recess. For the first time since the fatal evening when she and Grace Roseberry had met in the French cottage, Mercy Merrick looked back into the purgatory on earth of her past life, and told her sad story simply and truly in these words. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of The New Magdalen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Katy, Gurnee, Illinois. The New Magdalen by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 27. Magdalen's Apprenticeship. Mr. Julian Gray has asked me to tell him, and to tell you, Mr. Holmcroft, how my troubles began. They began before my recollection. They began with my birth. My mother, as I have heard her say, ruined her prospects, when she was quite a young girl, by a marriage with one of her father's servants, the groom who rode out with her. She suffered, poor creature, the usual penalty of such conduct as hers. After a short time she and her husband were separated, on the condition of her sacrificing to the man whom she had married the whole of the little fortune that she possessed in her right. Gaining her freedom, my mother had to gain her daily bread next. Her family refused to take her back. She attached herself to a company of strolling players. She was earning a bare living in this way, when my father accidentally met with her. He was a man of high rank, proud of his position, and well known in the society of that time for his many accomplishments and his refined tastes. My mother's beauty fascinated him. He took her from the strolling players, and surrounded her with every luxury that a woman could desire in a house of her own. I don't know how long they lived together. I only know that my father, at the time of my first recollections, had abandoned her. She had excited his suspicions of her fidelity, suspicions which cruelly wronged her, as she declared to her dying day. I believe her because she was my mother, but I cannot expect others to do as I did. I can only repeat what she said. My father left her absolutely penniless. He never saw her again, and he refused to go to her when she sent to him in her last moments on earth. She was back again among the strolling players when I first remember her. It was not an unhappy time for me. I was the favorite pet and plaything of the poor actors. They taught me to sing and to dance at an age when other children are just beginning to learn to read. At 5 years old I was in what is called the profession, and had made my poor little reputation in booths at country fairs. As early as that, Mr. Holmcroft, I had begun to live under an assumed name, the prettiest name they could invent for me, to look well in the bills. It was sometimes a hard struggle for us, in bad seasons, to keep body and soul together. Learning to sing and dance in public often meant learning to bear hunger and cold in private, when I was apprenticed to the stage. And yet I have lived to look back on my days with the strolling players as the happiest days of my life. I was 10 years old when the first serious misfortune that I can remember fell upon me. My mother died, worn out in the prime of her life. And not long afterward, the strolling company, brought to the end of its resources by a succession of bad seasons, was broken up. I was left on the world, a nameless, penniless outcast, with one fatal inheritance. God knows I can speak of it without vanity after what I have gone through, the inheritance of my mother's beauty. My only friends were the poor starved-out players. 2 of them, husband and wife, obtained engagements in another company, and I was included in the bargain. The new manager by whom I was employed was a drunkard and a brute. One night I made a trifling mistake in the course of the performances, and I was savagely beaten for it. Perhaps I had inherited some of my father's spirit, without, I hope, also inheriting my father's pitiless nature. However that may be, I resolved, no matter what became of me, never again to serve the man who had beaten me. I unlocked the door of our miserable lodging at daybreak the next morning, and, at 10 years old, with my little bundle in my hand, I faced the world alone. My mother had confided to me, in her last moments, my father's name and the address of his house in London. "He may feel some compassion for you," she said, "though he feels none for me. Try him." I had a few shillings, the last pitiful remains of my wages, in my pocket, and I was not far from London, but I never went near my father, child as I was. I would have starved and died rather than go to him. I had loved my mother dearly, and I hated the man who had turned his back on her when she lay on her deathbed. It made no difference to me that he happened to be my father. Does this confession revolt you? You look at me, Mr. Holmcroft, as if it did. Think a little, sir. Does what I have just said condemn me as a heartless creature, even in my earliest years? What is a father to a child, when the child has never sat on his knee and never had a kiss or a present from him? If we had met in the street, we should not have known each other. Perhaps in after days, when I was starving in London, I may have begged my father without knowing it, and he may have thrown his daughter a penny to get rid of her, without knowing it either. What is there sacred in the relations between father and child, when they are such relations as these? Even the flowers of the field cannot grow without light and air to help them. How is a child's love to grow with nothing to help it? My small savings would have been soon exhausted, even if I had been old enough and strong enough to protect them myself. As things were, my few shillings were taken from me by gypsies. I had no reason to complain. They gave me food and the shelter of their tents, and they made me of use to them in various ways. After a while, hard times came to the gypsies, as they had come to the strolling players. Some of them were imprisoned. The rest were dispersed. It was the season for hop gathering at the time. I got employment among the hop pickers next, and that done, I went to London with my new friends. I have no wish to weary and pain you by dwelling on this part of my childhood in detail. It will be enough if I tell you that I sank lower and lower until I ended in selling matches in the street. My mother's legacy got me many a sixpence, which my matches would never have charmed out of the pockets of strangers, if I had been an ugly child. My face, which was destined to be my greatest misfortune in after years, was my best friend in those days. Is there anything, Mr. Holmcroft, in the life I am now trying to describe, which reminds you of a day when we were out walking together, not long since? I surprised and offended you, I remember, and it was not possible for me to explain my conduct at the time. Do you recollect the little wandering girl, with the miserable faded nosegay in her hand, who ran after us, and begged for a halfpenny? I shocked you by bursting out crying when the child asked us to buy her a bit of bread. Now you know why I was so sorry for her. Now you know why I offended you the next day by breaking an engagement with your mother and sisters, and going to see that child in her wretched home. After what I have confessed, you will admit that my poor little sister in adversity had the first claim on me. Let me go on. I am sorry if I have distressed you. Let me go on. The forlorn wanderers of the street have, as I found it, one way always open to them of presenting their sufferings to the notice of their rich and charitable fellow creatures. They have only to break the law, and they make a public appearance in a court of justice. If the circumstances connected with their offense are of an interesting kind, they gain a second advantage. They are advertised all over England by a report in the newspapers. Yes, even I have my knowledge of the law. I know that it completely overlooked me as long as I respected it, but on 2 different occasions it became my best friend when I set it at defiance. My first fortunate offense was committed when I was just 12 years old. It was evening time. I was half dead with starvation. The rain was falling. The night was coming on. I begged, openly, loudly, as only a hungry child can beg. An old lady in a carriage at a shop door complained of my importunity. The policeman did his duty. The law gave me a supper and shelter at the station house that night. I appeared at the police court, and, questioned by the magistrate, I told my story truly. It was the everyday story of thousands of children like me, but it had one element of interest in it. I confessed to having had a father (he was then dead) who had been a man of rank, and I owned, just as openly as I owned everything else, that I had never applied to him for help, in resentment of his treatment of my mother. This incident was new, I suppose. It led to the appearance of my case in the newspapers. The reporters further served my interests by describing me as pretty and interesting. Subscriptions were sent to the court. A benevolent married couple in a respectable sphere of life visited the workhouse to see me. I produced a favorable impression on them, especially on the wife. I was literally friendless. I had no unwelcome relatives to follow me and claim me. The wife was childless. The husband was a good-natured man. It ended in their taking me away with them to try me in service. I have always felt the aspiration, no matter how low I may have fallen, to struggle upward to a position above me, to rise, in spite of fortune, superior to my lot in life. Perhaps some of my father's pride may be at the root of this restless feeling in me. It seems to be a part of my nature. It brought me into this house, and it will go with me out of this house. Is it my curse or my blessing? I am not able to decide. On the first night when I slept in my new home, I said to myself, "They have taken me to be their servant. I will be something more than that. They shall end in taking me for their child." Before I had been a week in the house, I was the wife's favorite companion in the absence of her husband at his place of business. She was a highly accomplished woman, greatly her husband's superior in cultivation, and, unfortunately for herself, also his superior in years. The love was all on her side. Excepting certain occasions on which he roused her jealousy, they lived together on sufficiently friendly terms. She was one of the many wives who resign themselves to be disappointed in their husbands, and he was one of the many husbands who never know what their wives really think of them. Her one great happiness was in teaching me. I was eager to learn. I made rapid progress. At my pliant age I soon acquired the refinements of language and manner which characterized my mistress. It is only the truth to say that the cultivation which has made me capable of personating a lady was her work. For 3 happy years I lived under that friendly roof. I was between 15 and 16 years of age when the fatal inheritance from my mother cast its first shadow on my life. One miserable day the wife's motherly love for me changed in an instant to the jealous hatred that never forgives. Can you guess the reason? The husband fell in love with me. I was innocent. I was blameless. He owned it himself to the clergyman who was with him at his death. By that time years had passed. It was too late to justify me. He was at an age, when I was under his care, when men are usually supposed to regard women with tranquillity, if not with indifference. It had been the habit of years with me to look on him as my second father. In my innocent ignorance of the feeling which really inspired him, I permitted him to indulge in little paternal familiarities with me, which inflamed his guilty passion. His wife discovered him, not I. No words can describe my astonishment and my horror when the first outbreak of her indignation forced on me the knowledge of the truth. On my knees I declared myself guiltless. On my knees I implored her to do justice to my purity and my youth. At other times, the sweetest and the most considerate of women, jealousy had now transformed her to a perfect fury. She accused me of deliberately encouraging him. She declared she would turn me out of the house with her own hands. Like other easy-tempered men, her husband had reserves of anger in him which it was dangerous to provoke. When his wife lifted her hand against me, he lost all self-control on his side. He openly told her that life was worth nothing to him without me. He openly avowed his resolution to go with me when I left the house. The maddened woman seized him by the arm. I saw that and saw no more. I ran out into the street, panic-stricken. A cab was passing. I got into it before he could open the house door, and drove to the only place of refuge I could think of, a small shop kept by the widowed sister of one of our servants. Here I obtained shelter for the night. The next day he discovered me. He made his vile proposals. He offered me the whole of his fortune. He declared his resolution, say what I might, to return the next day. That night, by the help of the good woman who had taken care of me, under cover of darkness, as if I had been to blame, I was secretly removed to the East End of London, and placed under the charge of a trustworthy person who lived, in a very humble way, by letting lodgings. Here, in a little back garret at the top of the house, I was thrown again on the world, an age when it was doubly perilous for me to be left to my own resources to earn the bread I ate and the roof that covered me. I claim no credit to myself, young as I was, placed as I was between the easy life of vice and the hard life of virtue, for acting as I did. The man simply horrified me. My natural impulse was to escape from him. But let it be remembered, before I approach the saddest part of my sad story, that I was an innocent girl, and that I was at least not to blame. Forgive me for dwelling as I have done on my early years. I shrink from speaking of the events that are still to come. In losing the esteem of my first benefactress, I had, in my friendless position, lost all hold on an honest life, except the one frail hold of needlework, the only reference of which I could now dispose was the recommendation of me by my landlady to a place of business which largely employed expert needlewomen. It is needless for me to tell you how miserably work of that sort is remunerated. You have read about it in the newspapers. As long as my health lasted, I contrived to live and to keep out of debt. Few girls could have resisted as long as I did the slowly poisoning influences of crowded workroom, insufficient nourishment, and almost total privation of exercise. My life as a child had been a life in the open air. It had helped to strengthen a constitution naturally hardy, naturally free from all taint of hereditary disease. But my time came at last. Under the cruel stress laid on it, my health gave way. I was struck down by low fever, and sentence was pronounced on me by my fellow lodgers. Ah, poor thing, her troubles will soon be at an end. The prediction might have proved true. I might never have committed the errors and endured the sufferings of after years, if I had fallen ill in another house. But it was my good or my evil fortune, I dare not say which, to have interested in myself and my sorrows an actress at a suburban theatre, who occupied the room under mine. Except when her stage duties took her away for 2 or 3 hours in the evening, this noble creature never left my bedside. Ill as she could afford it, her purse paid my inevitable expenses while I lay helpless. The landlady, moved by her example, accepted half the weekly rent of my room. The doctor, with the Christian kindness of his profession, would take no fees. All that the tenderest care could accomplish was lavished on me. My youth and my constitution did the rest. I struggled back to life, and then I took up my needle again. It may surprise you that I should have failed, having an actress for my dearest friend, to use the means of introduction thus offered to me to try the stage, especially as my childish training had given me, in some small degree, a familiarity with the art. I had only one motive for shrinking from an appearance at the theatre, but it was strong enough to induce me to submit to any alternative that remained, no matter how hopeless it might be. If I showed myself on the public stage, my discovery by the man from whom I had escaped would be only a question of time. I knew him to be habitually a playgoer and a subscriber to a theatrical newspaper. I had even heard him speak of the theatre to which my friend was attached, and compare it advantageously with places of amusement of far higher pretensions. Sooner or later, if I joined the company, He would be certain to go and see the new actress. The bare thought of it reconciled me to returning to my needle. Before I was strong enough to endure the atmosphere of the crowded workroom, I obtained permission, as a favor, to resume my occupation at home. Surely my choice was the choice of a virtuous girl, and yet the day when I returned to my needle was the fatal day of my life. I had now not only to provide for the wants of the passing hour, I had my debts to pay. It was only to be done by toiling harder than ever, and by living more poorly than ever. I soon paid the penalty, in my weakened state, of leading such a life as this. One evening my head turned suddenly giddy, my heart throbbed frightfully. I managed to open the window, and to let the fresh air into the room, and I felt better. But I was not sufficiently recovered to be able to thread my needle. I thought to myself, if I go out for half an hour, a little exercise may put me right again. I had not, as I suppose, been out more than 10 minutes, when the attack from which I suffered in my room was renewed. There was no shop near in which I could take refuge. I tried to ring the bell of the nearest house door. Before I could reach it, I fainted in the street. How long hunger and weakness left me at the mercy of the first stranger who might pass by, it is impossible for me to say. When I partially recovered my senses, I was conscious of being under shelter somewhere, and having a wine-glass containing some cordial drink held to my lips by a man. I managed to swallow, I don't know how little or how much. The stimulant had a very strange effect on me. Reviving me at first, it ended in stupefying me. I lost my senses once more. When I next recovered myself, the day was breaking. I was in a bed in a strange room. A nameless terror seized me. I called out. 3 or 4 women came in, whose faces betrayed, even to my inexperienced eyes, the shameless infamy of their lives. I started up in bed. I implored them to tell me where I was, and what had happened. "Spare me, I can say no more. Not long since you heard Miss Roseberry call me an outcast from the streets. Now you know, as God is my judge, I am speaking the truth. Now you know what made me an outcast, and in what measure I deserved my disgrace." Her voice faltered. Her resolution failed her for the first time. "Give me a few minutes," she said in low, pleading tones. "If I try to go on now, I am afraid I shall cry." She took the chair which Julian had placed for her, turning her face aside so that neither of the men could see it. One of her hands was pressed over her bosom, the other hung listlessly at her side. Julian rose from the place that he had occupied. Horace neither moved nor spoke. His head was on his breast. The traces of tears on his cheeks owned mutely that she had touched his heart. Would he forgive her? Julian passed on and approached Mercy's chair. In silence he took the hand which hung at her side. In silence he lifted it to his lips and kissed it, as her brother might have kissed it. She started, but she never looked up. Some strange fear of discovery seemed to possess her. "Horace?" she whispered timidly. Julian made no reply. He went back to his place, and allowed her to think it was Horace. The sacrifice was immense enough, feeling toward her as he felt, to be worthy of the man who made it. A few minutes had been all she asked for. In a few minutes she turned toward them again. Her sweet voice was steady once more. Her eyes rested softly on Horace as she went on. "What was it possible for a friendless girl in my position to do, when the full knowledge of the outrage had been revealed to me? If I had possessed near and dear relatives to protect and advise me, the wretches into whose hands I had fallen might have felt the penalty of the law. I knew no more of the formalities which set the law in motion than a child. But I had another alternative, you will say. Charitable societies would have received me and helped me if I had stated my case to them. I knew no more of the charitable societies than I knew of the law. At least, then, I might have gone back to the honest people among whom I had lived. When I received my freedom, after the interval of some days, I was ashamed to go back to the honest people. Helplessly and hopelessly, without sin or choice of mine, I drifted, as thousands of other women have drifted, into the life which set a mark on me for the rest of my days. Are you surprised at the ignorance which this confession reveals? You who have your solicitors to inform you of legal remedies, and your newspapers, circulars, and active friends to sound the praises of charitable institutions continually in your ears. You who possess these advantages have no idea of the outer world of ignorance in which your lost fellow creatures live. They know nothing, unless they are rogues accustomed to prey on society, of your benevolent schemes to help them. The purpose of public charities, and the way to discover and apply to them, ought to be posted at the corner of every street. What do we know of public dinners and eloquent sermons and neatly printed circulars? Every now and then the ease of some forlorn creature, generally of a woman, who has committed suicide, within 5 minutes' walk perhaps of an institution which would have opened its doors to her, appears in the newspapers, shocks you dreadfully, and is then forgotten again. Take as much pains to make charities and asylums known among the people without money as are taken to make a new play, a new journal, or a new medicine known among the people with money, and you will save many a lost creature who is perishing now. You will forgive and understand me if I say no more of this period in my life. Let me pass to the new incident in my career which brought me for the second time before the public notice in a court of law. Sad as my experience has been, it has not taught me to think ill of human nature. I had found kind hearts to feel for me in my former troubles, and I had friends, faithful, self-denying, generous friends, among my sisters in adversity now. One of these poor women, she has gone, I am glad to think, from the world that used her so hardly, especially attracted to my sympathies. She was the gentlest, the most unselfish creature I have ever met with. We lived together like sisters. More than once in the dark hours, when the thought of self-destruction comes to a desperate woman, the image of my poor devoted friend, left to suffer alone, rose in my mind and restrained me. You will hardly understand it, but even we had our happy days. When she or I had a few shillings to spare, we used to offer one another little presents, and enjoy our simple pleasure in giving and receiving as keenly as if we had been the most reputable women living. One day I took my friend into a shop to buy her a ribbon, only a bow for her dress. She was to choose it, and I was to pay for it, and it was to be the prettiest ribbon that money could buy. The shop was full. We had to wait a little before we could be served. Next to me, as I stood at the counter with my companion, was a gaudily dressed woman looking at some handkerchiefs. The handkerchiefs were finely embroidered, but the smart lady was hard to please. She tumbled them up disdainfully in a heap, and asked for other specimens from the stock in the shop. The man, in clearing the handkerchiefs out of the way, suddenly missed one. He was quite sure of it, from a peculiarity in the embroidery which made the handkerchief especially noticeable. I was poorly dressed, and I was close to the handkerchiefs. After one look at me, he shouted to the superintendent, "Shut the door, there is a thief in the shop." The door was closed. The lost handkerchief was vainly sought for on the counter and on the floor. A robbery had been committed, and I was accused of being the thief. I will say nothing of what I felt. I will only tell you what happened. I was searched, and the handkerchief was discovered on me. The woman who had stood next to me, on finding herself threatened with discovery, had no doubt contrived to slip the stolen handkerchief into my pocket. Only an accomplished thief could have escaped detection in that way without my knowledge. It was useless, in the face of the facts, to declare my innocence. I had no character to appeal to. My friend tried to speak for me, but what was she? Only a lost woman like myself. My landlady's evidence in favor of my honesty produced no effect. It was against her that she let lodgings to people in my position. I was prosecuted and found guilty. The tale of my disgrace is now complete, Mr. Holmcroft. No matter whether I was innocent or not, the shame of it remains. I have been imprisoned for theft. The matron of the prison was the next person who took an interest in me. She reported favorably of my behavior to the authorities, and when I had served my time, as the phrase was among us, she gave me a letter to the kind friend and guardian of my later years, to the lady who is coming here to take me back with her to the refuge. From this time the story of my life is little more than the story of a woman's vain efforts to recover her lost place in the world. The matron, on receiving me into the refuge, frankly acknowledged that there were terrible obstacles in my way, but she saw that I was sincere, and she felt a good woman's sympathy and compassion for me. On my side, I did not shrink from beginning the slow and weary journey back again to a reputable life from the humblest starting point, from domestic service. After first earning my new character in the refuge, I obtained a trial in a respectable house. I worked hard and worked uncomplainingly, but my mother's fatal legacy was against me from the first. My personal appearance excited remark. My manners and habits were not the manners and habits of the women among whom my lot was cast. I tried one place after another, always with the same results. Suspicion and jealousy I could endure, but I was defenseless when curiosity assailed me in its turn. Sooner or later inquiry led to discovery. Sometimes the servants threatened to give warning in a body, and I was obliged to go. Sometimes, where there was a young man in the family, scandal pointed at me and at him, and again I was obliged to go. If you care to know it, Miss Roseberry can tell you the story of those sad days. I confided it to her on the memorable night when we met in the French cottage. I have no heart to repeat it now. After a while I wearied of the hopeless struggle. Despair laid its hold on me. I lost all hope in the mercy of God. More than once I walked to one or other of the bridges, and looked over the parapet at the river, and said to myself, "Other women have done it. Why shouldn't I?" You saved me at that time, Mr. Gray, as you have saved me since. I was one of your congregation when you preached in the chapel of the refuge. You reconciled others besides me to our hard pilgrimage. In their name and in mine, sir, I thank you. I forget how long it was after the bright day when you comforted and sustained us, that war broke out between France and Germany. But I can never forget the evening when the matron sent for me into her own room and said, "My dear, your life here is a wasted life. If you have courage enough left to try it, I can give you another chance." I passed through a month of probation in a London hospital. A week after that I wore the Red Cross of the Geneva Convention. I was appointed nurse in a French ambulance. When you first saw me, Mr. Holmcroft, I still had my nurse's dress on, hidden from you and from everybody under a gray cloak. You know what the next event was. You know how I entered this house. I have not tried to make the worst of my trials and troubles in telling you what my life has been. I have honestly described it for what it was when I met with Miss Roseberry, a life without hope. May you never know the temptation that tried me when the shell struck its victim in the French cottage. There she lay, dead. Her name was untainted. Her future promised me the reward which had been denied to the honest efforts of a penitent woman. My lost place in the world was offered back to me on the one condition that I stooped to win it by a fraud. I had no prospect to look forward to. I had no friend near to advise me and to save me. The fairest years of my womanhood had been wasted in the vain struggle to recover my good name. Such was my position when the possibility of personating Miss Roseberry first forced itself on my mind. Impulsively, recklessly, wickedly, if you like, I seized the opportunity and let you pass me through the German lines under Miss Roseberry's name. Arrived in England, having had time to reflect, I made my first and last effort to draw back before it was too late. I went to the refuge, and stopped on the opposite side of the street, looking at it. The old hopeless life of irretrievable disgrace confronted me as I fixed my eyes on the familiar door. The horror of returning to that life was more than I could force myself to endure. An empty cab passed me at the moment. The driver held up his hand. In sheer despair I stopped him, and when he said, "Where to?" in sheer despair again I answered, "Mablethorpe House." Of what I have suffered in secret since my own successful deception established me under Lady Janet's care, I shall say nothing. Many things which must have surprised you in my conduct are made plain to you by this time. You must have noticed, long since, that I was not a happy woman. Now you know why. My confession is made. My conscience has spoken at last. You are released from your promise to me. You are free. Thank Mr. Julian Gray if I stand here, self-accused of the offense that I have committed, before the man whom I have wronged. End of chapter 27. Recording by Warren Katy, Gurnee, Illinois. Chapter 28 of The New Magdalen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Katy, Gurnee, Illinois. The New Magdalen by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 28. Sentence is pronounced on her. It was done. The last tones of her voice died away in silence. Her eyes still rested on Horace. After hearing what he had heard, could he resist that gentle, pleading look? Would he forgive her? A while since, Julian had seen tears on his cheeks, and had believed that he felt for her. Why was he now silent? Was it possible that he only felt for himself? For the last time, at the crisis of her life, Julian spoke for her. He had never loved her as he loved her at that moment. It tried even his generous nature to plead her cause with Horace against himself. But he had promised her, without reserve, all the help that her truest friend could offer. Faithfully and manfully he redeemed his promise. "Horace," he said. Horace slowly looked up. Julian rose and approached him. "She has told you to thank me, if her conscience has spoken. Thank the noble nature which answered when I called upon it. Own the priceless value of a woman who can speak the truth. Her heartfelt repentance is a joy in heaven. Shall it not plead for her on earth? Honor her, if you are a Christian. Feel for her, if you are a man." He waited. Horace never answered him. Mercy's eyes turned tearfully on Julian. His heart was the heart that felt for her. His words were the words which comforted and pardoned her. When she looked back again at Horace, it was with an effort. His last hold on her was lost. In her inmost mind a thought rose unbidden, a thought which was not to be repressed. Can I ever have loved this man? She advanced a step toward him. It was not possible, even yet, to completely forget the past. She held out her hand. He rose on his side, without looking at her. "Before we part forever," she said to him, "will you take my hand as a token that you forgive me?" He hesitated. He half lifted his hand. The next moment the generous impulse died away in him. In its place came the mean fear of what might happen if he trusted himself to the dangerous fascination of her touch. His hand dropped again at his side. He turned away quickly. "I can't forgive her," he said. With that horrible confession, without even a last look at her, he left the room. At the moment when he opened the door, Julian's contempt for him burst its way through all restraints. "Horace," he said, "I pity you." As the words escaped him, he looked back at Mercy. She had turned aside from both of them. She had retired to a distant part of the library. The first bitter foretaste of what was in store for her when she faced the world again had come to her from Horace. The energy which had sustained her thus far quailed before the dreadful prospect, doubly dreadful to a woman, of obloquy and contempt. She sank on her knees before a little couch in the darkest corner of the room. "Oh, Christ, have mercy on me!" That was her prayer, no more. Julian followed her. He waited a little. Then his kind hand touched her. His friendly voice fell consolingly on her ear. "Rise, poor wounded heart, beautiful, purified soul. God's angels rejoice over you. Take your place among the noblest of God's creatures." He raised her as he spoke. All her heart went out to him. She caught his hand. She pressed it to her bosom. She pressed it to her lips, then dropped it suddenly, and stood before him trembling like a frightened child. "Forgive me," was all she could say. "I was so lost and lonely, and you are so good to me." She tried to leave him. It was useless. Her strength was gone. She caught at the head of the couch to support herself. He looked at her. The confession of his love was just rising to his lips. He looked again, and checked it. No, not at that moment. Not when she was helpless and ashamed. Not when her weakness might make her yield, only to regret it at a later time. The great heart which had spared her and felt for her from the first, spared her and felt for her now. He too left her, but not without a word at parting. "Don't think of your future life just yet," he said gently. "I have something to propose when rest and quiet have restored you." He opened the nearest door, the door of the dining room, and went out. The servants engaged in completing the decoration of the dinner table noticed, when Mr. Julian entered the room, that his eyes were brighter than ever. He looked, they remarked, like a man who expected good news. They were inclined to suspect, though he was certainly rather young for it, that her ladyship's nephew was in a fair way of preferment in the church. Mercy seated herself on the couch. There are limits, in the physical organization of man, to the action of pain. When suffering has reached a given point of intensity, the nervous sensibility becomes incapable of feeling more. The rule of nature, in this respect, applies not only to sufferers in the body, but to sufferers in the mind as well. Grief, rage, terror have also their appointed limits. The moral sensibility, like the nervous sensibility, reaches its period of absolute exhaustion and feels no more. The capacity for suffering in Mercy had attained its term. Alone in the library, she could feel the physical relief of repose. She could vaguely recall Julian's parting words to her, and sadly wonder what they meant. But she could do no more. An interval passed, a brief interval of perfect rest. She recovered herself sufficiently to be able to look at her watch, and to estimate the lapse of time that might yet pass before Julian returned to her as he had promised. While her mind was still languidly following this train of thought, she was disturbed by the ringing of a bell in the hall, used to summon the servant whose duties were connected with that part of the house. In leaving the library, Horace had gone out by the door which led into the hall, and had failed to close it. She plainly heard the bell, and a moment later, more plainly still, she heard Lady Janet's voice. She started to her feet. Lady Janet's letter was still in the pocket of her apron, the letter which imperatively commanded her to abstain from making the very confession that had just passed her lips. It was near the dinner hour, and the library was the favorite place in which the mistress of the house and her guests assembled at that time. It was no matter of doubt. It was an absolute certainty that Lady Janet had only stopped in the hall on her way into the room. The alternative for Mercy lay between instantly leaving the library by the dining-room door, or remaining where she was, at the risk of being sooner or later compelled to own that she had deliberately disobeyed her benefactress. Exhausted by what she had already suffered, she stood trembling and irresolute, incapable of deciding which alternative she should choose. Lady Janet's voice, clear and resolute, penetrated into the room. She was reprimanding the servant who had answered the bell. "Is it your duty in my house to look after the lamps?" "Yes, my lady." "And is it my duty to pay you your wages?" "If you please, my lady." "Why do I find the light in the hall dim, and the wick of that lamp smoking? I have not failed in my duty to you. Don't let me find you failing again in your duty to me." Never had Lady Janet's voice sounded so sternly in Mercy's ear as it sounded now. If she spoke with that tone of severity to a servant who had neglected a lamp, what had her adopted daughter to expect, when she discovered that her entreaties and her commands had been alike set at defiance? Having administered her reprimand, Lady Janet had not done with the servant yet. She had a question to put to him next. "Where is Miss Roseberry?" "In the library, my lady." Mercy returned to the couch. She could stand no longer. She had not even resolution enough left to lift her eyes to the door. Lady Janet came in more rapidly than usual. She advanced to the couch, and tapped Mercy playfully on the cheek with two of her fingers. "You lazy child, not dressed for dinner? Oh, fie! Her tone was as playfully affectionate as the action which had accompanied her words. In speechless astonishment, Mercy looked up at her. Always remarkable for the taste and splendor of her dress, Lady Janet had, on this occasion, surpassed herself. There she stood, revealed in her grandest velvet, her richest jewelry, her finest lace, with no one to entertain at the dinner table but the ordinary members of the circle at Mablethorpe House. Noticing this as strange to begin with, Mercy further observed, for the first time in her experience, that Lady Janet's eyes avoided meeting hers. The old lady took her place companionably on the couch. She ridiculed her lazy child's plain dress, without an ornament of any sort on it, with her best grace. She affectionately put her arm round Mercy's waist, and rearranged with her own hand the disordered locks of Mercy's hair. But the instant Mercy herself looked at her, Lady Janet's eyes discovered something supremely interesting in the familiar objects that surrounded her on the library walls. How were these changes to be interpreted? To what possible conclusion did they point? Julian's profounder knowledge of human nature, if Julian had been present, might have found a clue to the mystery. He might have surmised, incredible as it was, that Mercy's timidity before Lady Janet was fully reciprocated by Lady Janet's timidity before Mercy. It was even so. The woman whose immovable composure had conquered Grace Roseberry's utmost insolence in the hour of her triumph, the woman who, without once flinching, had faced every other consequence of her resolution to ignore Mercy's true position in the house, quailed for the first time when she found herself face to face with the very person for whom she had suffered and sacrificed so much. She had shrunk from the meeting with Mercy, as Mercy had shrunk from the meeting with her. The splendor of her dress meant simply that, when other excuses for delaying the meeting downstairs had all been exhausted, the excuse for a long and elaborate toilet had been tried next. Even the moments occupied in reprimanding the servant had been moments seized on as the pretext for another delay. The hasty entrance into the room, the nervous assumption of playfulness in language and manner, the evasive and wandering eyes, were all referable to the same cause. In the presence of others, Lady Janet had successfully silenced the protest of her own inbred delicacy and inbred sense of honor. In the presence of Mercy, whom she loved with a mother's love, in the presence of Mercy, for whom she had stooped to deliberate concealment of the truth, all that was high and noble in the woman's nature rose in her and rebuked her. What will the daughter of my adoption, the child of my first and last experience of maternal love, think of me, now that I have made myself an accomplice in the fraud of which she is ashamed? How can I look her in the face when I have not hesitated, out of selfish consideration for my own tranquillity, to forbid that frank avowal of the truth which her finer sense of duty had spontaneously bound her to make? Those were the torturing questions in Lady Janet's mind, while her arm was wound affectionately round Mercy's waist, while her fingers were busying themselves familiarly with the arrangement of Mercy's hair. Thence, and thence only, sprang the impulse which set her talking, with an uneasy affectation of frivolity, of any topic within the range of conversation, so long as it related to the future, and completely ignored the present and the past. "The winter here is unendurable," Lady Janet began. "I have been thinking, Grace, about what we had better do next." Mercy started. Lady Janet had called her Grace. Lady Janet was still deliberately assuming to be innocent of the faintest suspicion of the truth. "No," resumed her ladyship, affecting to misunderstand Mercy's movement. "You are not to go up now and dress. There is no time, and I am quite ready to excuse you. You are a foil to me, my dear. You have reached the perfection of shabbiness. Ah, I remember when I had my whims and fancies too, and when I looked well in anything I wore, just as you do. No more of that. As I was saying, I've been thinking and planning what we are to do. We really can't stay here, cold one day and hot the next. What a climate! As for society, what do we lose if we go away? There is no such thing as society now. Assemblies of well-dressed mobs meet at each other's houses, tear each other's clothes, tread on each other's toes. If you are particularly lucky, you sit on the staircase. You get a tepid ice and you hear vapid talk in slang phrases all round you. There is modern society. If we had a good opera, it would be something to stay in London for. Look at the program for the season on that table, promising as much as possible on paper, and performing as little as possible on the stage. The same works, sung by the same singers year after year, to the same stupid people, in short, the dullest musical evenings in Europe. No, the more I think of it, the more plainly I perceive that there is but one sensible choice before us. We must go abroad. Set that pretty head to work. Choose north or south, east or west. It's all the same to me. Where shall we go?" Mercy looked at her quickly as she put the question. Lady Janet, more quickly yet, looked away at the program of the opera house. Still the same melancholy false pretenses. Still the same useless and cruel delay. Incapable of enduring the position now forced upon her, Mercy put her hand into the pocket of her apron, and drew from it Lady Janet's letter. "Will your ladyship forgive me," she began in faint, faltering tones, "if I venture on a painful subject? I hardly dare acknowledge." In spite of her resolution to speak out plainly, the memory of past love and past kindness prevailed with her. The next words died away on her lips. She could only hold up the letter. Lady Janet declined to see the letter. Lady Janet suddenly became absorbed in the arrangement of her bracelets. "I know what you daren't acknowledge, you foolish child," she exclaimed. You daren't acknowledge that you are tired of this doll-house. My dear, I am entirely of your opinion. I am weary of my own magnificence. I long to be living in one snug little room with one servant to wait on me. I'll tell you what we will do. We will go to Paris in the first place. My excellent Miglior, Prince of Couriers, shall be the only person in attendance. He shall take a lodging for us in one of the unfashionable quarters of Paris. We will rough it, Grace, to use the slang phrase, merely for a change. We will lead what they call a bohemian life. I know plenty of writers and painters and actors in Paris, the liveliest society in the world, my dear, until one gets tired of them. We will dine at the restaurant and go to the play and drive about in shabby little hired carriages. And when it begins to get monotonous, which it is only sure to do, we will spread our wings and fly to Italy, and cheat the winter in that way. There is a plan for you. Miglior is in town. I will send to him this evening, and we will start tomorrow. Mercy made another effort. I entreat your ladyship to pardon me, she resumed. I have something serious to say. I am afraid. I understand. You are afraid of crossing the Channel, and you don't like to acknowledge it. Pooh! The passage barely lasts 2 hours, and we will shut ourselves up in a private cabin. I will send at once. The courier may be engaged. Ring the bell. Lady Janet, I must submit to my hard lot. I cannot hope to associate myself again with any future plan of yours. What? You are afraid of our bohemian life in Paris? Observe this, Grace. If there is one thing I hate more than another, it is an old head on young shoulders. I say no more. Ring the bell. This cannot go on, Lady Janet. No words can say how unworthy I feel of your kindness, how ashamed I am. Upon my honor, my dear, I agree with you. You ought to be ashamed, at your age, of making me get up to ring the bell. Her obstinacy was immovable. She attempted to rise from the couch, but one choice was left to Mercy. She anticipated Lady Janet, and rang the bell. The manservant came in. He had his little letter tray in his hand, with a card on it, and a sheet of paper beside the card, which looked like an open letter. You know where my courier lives when he is in London? Asked Lady Janet. Yes, my lady. Send one of the grooms to him on horseback. I am in a hurry. The courier is to come here without fail tomorrow morning, in time for the tidal train to Paris. You understand? Yes, my lady. What have you got there? Anything for me? For Miss Roseberry, my lady. As he answered, the man handed the card and the open letter to Mercy. The lady is waiting in the morning room, miss. She wished me to say she has time to spare, and she will wait for you if you are not yet ready. Having delivered his message in those terms, he withdrew. Mercy read the name on the card. The matron had arrived. She looked at the letter next. It appeared to be a printed circular, with some lines in pencil added on the empty page. Printed lines and written lines swam before her eyes. She felt, rather than saw, Lady Janet's attention steadily and suspiciously fixed on her. With the matron's arrival, the foredoomed end of the flimsy false pretenses and the cruel delays had come. A friend of yours, my dear? Yes, Lady Janet. Am I acquainted with her? I think not, Lady Janet. You appear to be agitated. Does your visitor bring bad news? Is there anything that I can do for you? You can add, immeasurably add, madam, to all your past kindness, if you will only bear with me and forgive me. Bear with you and forgive you? I don't understand. I will try to explain. Whatever else you may think of me, Lady Janet, for God's sake don't think me ungrateful. Lady Janet held up her hand for silence. I dislike explanations, she said sharply. Nobody ought to know that better than you. Perhaps the lady's letter will explain for you. Why have you not looked at it yet? I am in great trouble, madam, as you noticed just now. Have you any objection to my knowing who your visitor is? No, Lady Janet. Let me look at her card, then. Mercy gave the matron's card to Lady Janet, as she had given the matron's telegram to Horace. Lady Janet read the name on the card, considered, decided that it was a name quite unknown to her, and looked next at the address. Western District Refuge, Milburn Road. "A lady connected with the refuge," she said, speaking to herself, "and calling here by appointment. If I remember the servant's message. A strange time to choose, if she has come for a subscription." She paused, her brow contracted, her face hardened. A word from her would now have brought the interview to its inevitable end, and she refused to speak the word. To the last moment she persisted in ignoring the truth. Placing the card on the couch at her side, she pointed with her long yellow-white forefinger to the printed letter lying side by side with her own letter on Mercy's lap. "Do you mean to read it or not?" she asked. Mercy lifted her eyes, fast filling with tears, to Lady Janet's face. "May I beg that your ladyship will read it for me?" she said, and placed the matron's letter in Lady Janet's hand. It was a printed circular announcing a new development in the charitable work of the refuge. Subscribers were informed that it had been decided to extend the shelter and the training of the institution, thus far devoted to fallen women alone, so as to include destitute and helpless children found wandering in the streets. The question of the number of children to be thus rescued and protected was left dependent, as a matter of course, on the bounty of the friends of the refuge, the cost of the maintenance of each child being stated at the lowest possible rate. A list of influential persons who had increased their subscriptions so as to cover the cost, and a brief statement of the progress already made with the new work, completed the appeal and brought the circular to its end. The lines traced in pencil, in the matron's handwriting, followed on the blank page. "Your letter tells me, my dear, that you would like, remembering your own childhood, to be employed when you return among us in saving other poor children left helpless on the world. Our circular will inform you that I am able to meet your wishes. My first errand this evening in your neighborhood was to take charge of a poor child, a little girl, who stands sadly in need of our care. I have ventured to bring her with me, thinking she might help to reconcile you to the coming change in your life. You will find us both waiting to go back with you to the old home. I write this letter instead of saying it, hearing from the servant that you are not alone, and being unwilling to intrude myself, as a stranger, on the lady of the house." Lady Janet read the penciled lines, as she had read the printed sentences, aloud. Without a word of comment, she laid the letter where she had laid the card, and, rising from her seat, stood for a moment in stern silence, looking at Mercy. The sudden change in her, which the letter had produced, quietly as it had taken place, was terrible to see. On the frowning brow, in the flashing eyes, on the hardened lips, outraged love and outraged pride looked down on the lost woman and said, as if in words, "You have roused us at last." "If that letter means anything," she said, "it means you are about to leave my house. There can be but one reason for you taking such a step as that." "It is the only atonement I can make, madam." "I see another letter on your lap. Is it my letter?" "Yes." "Have you read it?" "I have read it." "Have you seen Horace Holmcroft?" "Yes." "Have you told Horace Holmcroft?" "Oh, Lady Janet!" "Don't interrupt me. Have you told Horace Holmcroft what my letter positively forbade you to communicate, either to him or to any living creature? I want no protestations and excuses. Answer me instantly, and answer in one word, yes or no." Not even that haughty language, not even those pitiless tones, could extinguish in Mercy's heart the sacred memories of past kindness and past love. She fell on her knees. Her outstretched hands touched Lady Janet's dress. Lady Janet sharply drew her dress away, and sternly repeated her last words. "Yes or no?" "Yes." She had owned it at last. To this end, Lady Janet had submitted to Grace Roseberry, had offended Horace Holmcroft, had stooped, for the first time in her life, to concealments and compromises that degraded her. After all that she had sacrificed and suffered, there Mercy knelt at her feet, self-convicted of violating her commands, trampling on her feelings, deserting her house. And who was the woman who had done this? The same woman who had perpetrated the fraud, and who had persisted in the fraud until her benefactress had descended to become her accomplice. Then, and then only, she had suddenly discovered that it was her sacred duty to tell the truth. In proud silence, the great lady met the blow that had fallen on her. In proud silence, she turned her back on her adopted daughter and walked to the door. Mercy made her last appeal to the kind friend whom she had offended, to the second mother whom she had loved. Lady Janet, don't leave me without a word. Oh, madam, try to feel for me a little. I am returning to a life of humiliation. The shadow of my old disgrace is falling on me once more. We shall never meet again, even though I have not deserved it. Let my repentance plead with you. Say you forgive me. Lady Janet turned round on the threshold of the door. I never forgive ingratitude, she said. Go back to the refuge. The door opened and closed on her. Mercy was alone again in the room. Unforgiven by Horace, unforgiven by Lady Janet. She put her hands to her burning head and tried to think. Oh, for the cool air of the night! Oh, for the friendly shelter of the refuge! She could feel those sad longings in her. It was impossible to think. She rang the bell, and shrank back the instant she had done it. Had she any right to take that liberty? She ought to have thought of it before she rang. Habit, all habit. How many hundreds of times she had rung the bell at Mablethorpe House. The servant came in. She amazed the man. She spoke to him so timidly. She even apologized for troubling him. "I'm sorry to disturb you. Will you be so kind as to say to the lady that I am ready for her?" "Wait to give that message," said a voice behind them, "until you hear the bell rung again." Mercy looked round in amazement. Julian had returned to the library by the dining-room door. End of chapter 28. Recording by Warren Katy, Gurnee, Illinois.
Chapter 29 of The New Magdalen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The New Magdalen by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 29. The Last Trial. "Mr. Gray," she exclaimed, "why have you delayed my message? If you knew all, you would know that it is far from being a kindness to keep me in this house." He advanced closer to her, surprised by her words, alarmed by her looks. "Has anyone been here in my absence?" he asked. "Lady Janet has been here in your absence. I can't speak of it. My heart feels crushed. I can bear no more. Let me go." Briefly as she had replied, she had said enough. Julian's knowledge of Lady Janet's character told him what had happened. His face showed plainly that he was disappointed as well as distressed. "I had hoped to have been with you when you and my aunt met, and to have prevented this," he said. "Believe me, she will atone for all she may have harshly and hastily done when she's had time to think. Try not to regret it. If she has made your hard sacrifice harder still, she has only raised you the higher. She has additionally ennobled you and endeared you in my estimation. Forgive me if I own this in plain words. I cannot control myself. I feel too strongly." At other times Mercy might have heard the coming of avowal in his tones, might have discovered it in his eyes. As it was, her delicate insight was dulled, her fine perception was blunted. She held out her hand to him, feeling a vague conviction that he was kinder to her than ever, and feeling no more. "I must thank you for the last time," she said. "As long as life is left, my gratitude will be part of my life. Let me go, while I can still control myself. Let me go." She tried to leave him and ring the bell. He held her hand firmly and drew her closer to him. "To the refuge?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Home again." "Don't say that," he exclaimed. "I can't bear to hear it. Don't call the refuge your home." "What else is it? Where else can I go?" "I come here to tell you," I said. "If you remember, I had something to propose." She felt the fervent pressure of his hand. She saw the mounting enthusiasm flashing in his eyes. Her weary mind roused itself a little. She began to tremble under the electric influence of his touch. "Something to propose," she repeated. "What is there to propose?" "Let me ask you a question on my side. What have you done today?" "You know what I have done. It's your work," she answered humbly. "Why return to it now?" "I return to it for the last time. I return to it with a purpose which you will soon understand. You have abandoned your marriage engagement. You have forfeited Lady Janet's love. You have ruined all your worldly prospects, and you are now returning, self-devoted, to a life which you yourself have described as a life without hope. And all this you have done of your own free will, at a time when you are absolutely secure of your position in the house, for the sake of speaking the truth. Now tell me, is a woman who can make that sacrifice a woman who will prove unworthy of trust if a man places her in keeping his honour and his name?" She understood him at last. She broke away from him with a cry. She stood with her hands clasped, trembling and looking at him. He gave her no time to think. The words poured from his lips without conscious will or conscious effort of his own. "Mercy, from the first moment when I saw you I loved you. You are free, I may own it. I may ask you to be my wife." She drew back from him further and further, with a wild imploring gesture of her hand. "No, no," she cried. "Think of what you are saying. Think of what you would sacrifice. It cannot, must not be." His face darkened with a sudden dread. His head fell on his breast. His voice sank so low that she could barely hear it. "I've forgotten something," he said. "You have reminded me of it." She ventured back a little nearer to him. "Have I offended you?" He smiled sadly. "You have enlightened me. I had forgotten that it doesn't follow because I love you that you should love me in return. Say that is so, Mercy, and I leave you." A faint tinge of colour rose on her face, then left it again paler than ever. Her eyes looked down timidly under the eager gaze that he fastened on her. "How can I say so?" she answered simply. "Where is the woman in my place whose heart could resist you?" Eagerly he advanced. He held out his arms to her in breathless, speechless joy. She drew back from him once more with a look that horrified him, a look of blank despair. "Am I fit to be your wife?" she asked. "Must I remind you of what you owe to your high position, your spotless integrity, your famous name? Think of all that you have done for me, and think of the black ingratitude of it if I ruin your life by consenting to our marriage. If I, selfishly, cruelly, wickedly, drag you down to the level of a woman like me." "I can raise you to my level when I make you my wife," he answered. "For heaven's sake, do me justice. Don't refer me to the world and its opinions. It rests with you and you alone to make the misery of the happiness of my life. The world, good God, what can the world give me in exchange for you?" She clasped her hands imploringly. The tears flowed fast over her cheeks. "Oh, have pity on my weakness," she cried. "Kindest, best of men, help me to do my duty toward you. It is so hard, after all that I have suffered, when my heart is yearning peace and happiness and love." She checked herself, shuddering at the words that had escaped her. "Remember how Mr. Holmcroft has used me. Remember how Lady Janet left me. Remember what I have told you of my life. The scorn of every creature you know would strike at you through me. No, 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 not a word more. Spare me, pity me, leave me." Her voice failed her. Her sobs choked her utterance. He sprang to her and took her in his arms. She was incapable of resisting him, but there was no yielding in her. Her head lay on his bosom, passive, horribly passive, like the head of a corpse. "Mercy, my darling, we will go away. We will leave England. We will take refuge among new people in a new world. I will change my name. I will break with relatives, friends, Everybody, anything, rather than lose you." She lifted her head slowly and looked at him. He suddenly released her. He reeled back like a man staggered by a blow, and dropped her into a chair. Before she had uttered a word, he saw the terrible resolution in her face. Death rather than yield to her own weakness and disgrace him. She stood with her hands lightly clasped in front of her. Her grand head was raised. Her soft grey eyes shone again, undimmed by tears. The storm of emotion had swept over her and had passed away. A sad tranquillity was in her face. A gentle resignation was in her voice. The calm of a martyr was the calm that confronted him as she spoke her last words. "A woman who has lived my life, a woman who has suffered what I have suffered, may love you as I love you, but she must not be your wife. That place is too high above her. Any other place is too far below her and below you." She paused, advancing to the bell, gave the signal for her departure. That done, she slowly retraced her steps until she stood at Julian's side. Tenderly she lifted his head and laid it for a moment on her bosom. Silently she stooped and touched his forehead with her lips. All the gratitude that filled her heart and all the sacrifice that rent it were in those two actions, so modestly, so tenderly performed. As the last lingering pressure of her fingers left him, Julian burst into tears. The servant answered the bell. The moment he opened the door, a woman's voice was audible in the hall, speaking to him. "Let the child go in," the voice said. "I will wait here." The child appeared, the same forlorn little creature who had reminded Mercy of her own early years on the day when she and Harris Holmcroft had been out for their walk. There was no beauty in this child, no halo of romance, brightened by the commonplace horror of her story. She came cringing into the room, staring stupidly at the magnificence all around her. The daughter of the London streets, pet creation of the laws of political economy, the savage and terrible product of a worn-out system of government and of a civilization rotten to its core. Clean for the first time in her life, fed sufficiently for the first time in her life, dressed in clothes instead of rags for the first time in her life, Mercy's sister in adversity crept fearfully over the beautiful carpet and stopped wonder-struck before the marbles of an inlaid table, a blot of mud on the splendour of the room. Mercy turned from Julian to meet the child. The woman's heart, hungering in its horrible isolation for something that might harmlessly love, welcomed the rescued waif of the streets as a consolation sent from God. She caught the stupefied little creature up in her arms. "Kiss me," she whispered, in the reckless agony of the moment. "Call me sister." The child stared vacantly. Sister meant nothing to her mind, but an older girl who was strong enough to beat her. She put the child down again and turned for a last look at the man whose happiness she had wrecked, in pity to him. He never moved. His head was down, his face was hidden. She went back to him a few steps. "The others have gone from me without one kind word. Can you forgive me?" He held out his hand to her without looking up. Sorely as she had wounded him, his generous nature understood her. True to her from the first, he was true to her still. "God bless and comfort you," he said in broken tones. "The earth holds no nobler woman than you." She knelt and kissed the hand that pressed hers for the last time. "It doesn't end with this world," she whispered. "There's a better world to come." And she rose and went back to the child. Hand in hand, the two citizens of the government of God, outcasts of the government of man, passed slowly down the length of the room, then out into the hall, then out into the night. The heavy clang of the closing door tolled the knell of their departure. They were gone. But the orderly routine of the house, inexorable as death, pursued its appointed course. As the clock struck the hour, the dinner bell rang. An interval of a minute passed and marked the limit of delay. The butler appeared in the dining room. "Dinner is served, sir." Julian looked up. The empty room met his eyes. Something white lay on the carpet close by him. It was her handkerchief, wet with her tears. He took it up and pressed it to his lips. Was that to be the last of her? Had she left him for ever? The native energy of the man arming itself with all the might of his love kindled in him again. No, while life was in him, while time was before him, there was hope of winning her yet. He turned to the servant, reckless of what his face might betray. "Where is Lady Janet?" "In the dining room, sir." He reflected for a moment. His own influence had failed. Through what other influence could he now hope to reach her? As the question crossed his mind, the light broke on him. He saw the way back to her through the influence of Lady Janet. "Her ladyship is waiting, sir." Julian entered the dining room. End of chapter 29. Epilogue of the New Magdalen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The New Magdalen by Wilkie Collins. Epilogue. Containing selections from the correspondence of Miss Grace Roseberry and Mr. Horace Holmcroft, to which are added extracts from the diary of the Reverend Julian Gray. Part 1. From Mr. Horace Holmcroft to Miss Grace Roseberry. I hasten to thank you, dear Miss Roseberry, for your last kind letter, received by yesterday's mail from Canada. Believe me, I appreciate your generous readiness to pardon and forget what I so rudely said to you at the time when the arts of an adventuress had blinded me to the truth. In the grace which has forgiven me, I recognize the inbred sense of justice of a true lady. Birth and breeding can never fail to assert themselves. I believe in them, thank God, more firmly than ever. You asked me to keep you informed of the progress of Julian Gray's infatuation, and the course of conduct pursued toward him by Mercy Merrick. If you had not favoured me by explaining your object, I might have felt some surprise at receiving from a lady in your position such a request as this. But the motives by which you describe yourself as being actuated are beyond dispute. The existence of society, as you truly say, is threatened by the present lamentable prevalence of liberal ideas throughout the length and breadth of the land. We can only hope to protect ourselves against impostors interested in gaining a position among persons of our rank by becoming in some sort, unpleasant as it may be, familiar with the arts by which imposture too frequently succeeds. If we wish to know what daring lengths of cunning we can go to, what pitiable self-delusion credulity can consent, we must watch the proceedings, even while we shrink from them, of a Mercy Merrick and a Julian Gray. I am taking up my narrative again where my last letter left off. I must venture to set you right on one point. Certain expressions which have escaped your pen suggest to me that you blame Julian Gray as the cause of Lady Janet's regrettable visit to the Refuge the day after Mercy Merrick had left their house. This is not quite correct. Julian, as you will presently see, has enough to answer for without being held responsible for errors of judgment in which he has had no share. Lady Janet, as she herself told me, went to the Refuge of her own free will, to ask Mercy Merrick's pardon for the language which she had just used on the previous day. I passed a night of such misery as no words can describe. This, I assure you, is what her ladyship really said to me. Thinking over what my vile pride and selfishness and obstinacy had made me say and do, I would have gone down on my knees to beg her pardon if she would have let me. My first happy moment was when I won her consent to come and visit me sometimes at Mablethorpe House. You will, I am sure, agree with me that such extravagance as this is to be pitied rather than blamed. How sad to see the decay of the faculties with advancing age! It is a matter of grave anxiety to consider how much longer poor Lady Janet can be trusted to manage her own affairs. I shall take an opportunity of touching on that matter delicately when I next see her lawyer. I am straying from my subject, and, is it not strange, I am writing to you as confidentially as if we were old friends. To return to Julian Gray. innocent of instigating his aunt's first visit to the refuge. He is guilty of having induced you to go there for the second time the day after I had dispatched my last letter to you. Lady Janet's object on this occasion was neither more nor less than to plead her nephew's cause as a humble suitor for the hand of Mercy Merrick. Imagine the descent of one of the oldest families in England inviting an adventuress in a refuge to honour a clergyman of the Church of England by becoming his wife. In what times do we live? My dear mother shed tears of shame when she heard of it. How you would love and admire my mother! I dined at Mablethorpe House by previous appointment on the day when Lady Janet returned from her degrading errand. "Well," I said, waiting of course until the servant was out of the room. "Well," Lady Janet answered, "Julian was quite right." "Quite right in what?" "In saying that the earth holds no nobler woman than Mercy Merrick." "Has she refused him again?" "She has refused him again." Thank God! I felt it fervently, and I said it fervently. Lady Janet laid down her knife and fork, and fixed one of her fierce looks on me. "It may not be your fault, Horace," she said, "but if your nature is incapable of comprehending what is great and generous in other natures higher than yours, but the least you can do is to distrust your own capacity of appreciation. For the future, keep your opinions on questions which you don't understand modestly to yourself. I have a tenderness for you, for your father's sake, and I take the most favourable view of your conduct toward Mercy Merrick. I humanly consider it the conduct of a fool. Her own words, Miss Roseberry, I assure you once more, her own words. But don't trespass too far on my indulgence. Don't insinuate again that a woman who is good enough, if she died this night, to go to heaven, is not good enough to be my nephew's wife. I expressed to you my conviction a little way back that it was doubtful whether poor Lady Janet would be much longer competent to manage her own affairs. Perhaps you thought me hasty then. What do you think now? It was of course useless to reply seriously to the extraordinary reprimand that I had received. I was really shocked by a decay of principle which proceeded but too plainly from decay of the mental powers. I made a soothing and respectful reply, and I was favoured in return with some account of what really had happened at the refuge. My mother and my sisters were disgusted when I repeated the particulars to them. You will be disgusted too. The interesting penitent, expecting Lady Janet's visit, was of course discovered in a touching domestic position. She had a foundling baby asleep on her lap, and she was teaching the alphabet to an ugly little vagabond girl, whose acquaintance she had first met in the street. Just the sort of artful tableau vivant to impose upon an old lady, was it not? You will understand what followed when Lady Janet opened her matrimonial negotiation. Having perfected herself in her part, Mercy Merrick, to do her justice, was not the woman to play it badly. The most magnanimous sentiments flowed from her lips. She declared that her future life was devoted to acts of charity, typified of course by the foundling infant and the ugly little girl. However she might personally suffer, whatever might be the sacrifice of her own feelings, observe how artfully this was put, to insinuate that she was herself in love with him. She could not accept from Mr. Julian Gray an honour of which he was unworthy. Her gratitude to him, and her interest in him alike, forbade her to compromise his brilliant future by consenting to a marriage which would degrade him in the estimation of all his friends. She thanked him with tears. She thanked Lady Janet with more tears. But she dare not, in the interests of his honour and his happiness, accept the hand that he offered to her. God bless and comfort him, and God help her to bear with her hard lot. The object of this contemptible comedy is plain enough to my mind. She was simply holding off. Julian, as you know, is a poor man, until the influence of Lady Janet's persuasion is backed by the opening of Lady Janet's purse. In one word, settlements. But for the profanity of the woman's language and the really lamentable credulity of the poor old lady, the whole thing would make it a fit subject for a burlesque. But the saddest part of the story is still to come. In due course of time, the lady's decision was communicated to Julian Gray. He took leave of his senses on the spot. Can you believe it? He has resigned his curacy. At a time when the church is thronged every Sunday to hear him preach, this madman shuts the door and walks out of the pulpit. Even Lady Janet was not far enough gone in folly to abet him in this. She remonstrated like the rest of his friends. Perfectly useless. He had but one answer to everything they could say: my career is closed. What stuff! You will ask, naturally enough, what this perverse man is going to do next. I don't scruple to say that he is bent on committing suicide. Pray do not be alarmed. There is no fear of the pistol, the rope, or the river. Julian is simply courting death within the limits of the law. This is strong language, I know. You shall hear what the facts are and judge for yourself. Having resigned his curacy, in his next proceeding was to offer his services as a volunteer to a new missionary enterprise on the west coast of Africa. The persons at the head of the mission proved, most fortunately, to have a proper sense of their duty. Expressing their conviction of the value of Julian's assistance in the most handsome terms, they made it nevertheless a condition of entertaining his proposal that he should submit to an examination by a competent medical man. After some hesitation he consented to this. The doctor's report was conclusive. In Julian's present state of health, the climate of West Africa would in all probability kill him in 3 months' time. Foiled in his first attempt, he addressed himself next to a London mission. Here it was impossible to raise the question of climate, and here, I grieve to say, he has succeeded. He is now working, in other words, he is now deliberately risking his life, in the mission to Green Anchor Fields. The district known by this name is situated in a remote part of London near the Thames. It is notoriously infested by the most desperate and degraded set of wretches in the whole metropolitan population, and is so thickly inhabited that it is hardly ever completely free from epidemic disease. In this horrible place, and among these dangerous people, Julian is now employing himself from morning to night. None of his old friends ever see him. Since he has joined the mission he has not even called on Lady Janet Roy. My pledge is redeemed. The facts are before you. Am I wrong in taking my gloomy view of the prospect? I cannot forget that this unhappy man was once my friend, and I really see no hope for him in the future. Deliberately self-exposed to the violence of ruffians and the outbreak of disease, who is to extricate him from his shocking position? The one person who can do it is the person whose association with him would be his ruin. Mercy Merrick. Heaven only knows what disasters it may be my painful duty to communicate to you in my next letter. You are so kind as to ask me to tell you something about myself and my plans. I have very little to say on either head. After what I have suffered, my feelings trampled on, my confidence betrayed, I am as yet hardly capable of deciding what I shall do. Returning to my old profession, to the army, is out of the question. In these levelling days, when any obscure person who can pass an examination may call himself my brother officer, and may one day perhaps command me as my superior in rank, if I think of any career, it is the career of diplomacy. Birth and breeding have not quite disappeared as essential qualifications in that branch of the public service. But I have decided nothing as yet. My mother and sisters, in the event of your returning to England, desire me to say that it will afford them the greatest pleasure to make your acquaintance. Sympathizing with me, they do not forget what you too have suffered. A warm welcome awaits you when you pay your first visit at our house. Most truly yours, Horace Holmcroft. Part 2. From Miss Grace Roseberry to Mr. Horace Holmcroft. Dear Mr. Holmcroft, I snatch a few moments from my other avocations to thank you for your most interesting and delightful letter. How well you describe, how accurately you judge. If literature stood a little higher as a profession, I should almost advise you, but no. If you entered literature, how could you associate with the people whom you would be likely to meet? Between ourselves, I always thought Mr. Julian Gray an overrated man. I will not say he has justified my opinion. I will only say I pity him. But, dear Mr. Holmcroft, how can you, with your sound judgment, place the sad alternatives now before him on the same level? To die in green anchor fields, or to fall into the clutches of that vile wretch? Is there any comparison between the two? Better 1,000 times die at the post of duty than marry Mercy Merrick. As I have written the creature's name, I may add, so as to have all the sooner done with the subject, that I shall look with anxiety for your next letter. Do not suppose that I feel the smallest curiosity about this degraded and designing woman. My interest in her is purely religious. To persons of my devout turn of mind, she is an awful warning. When I feel Satan near me, it will be such a means of grace to think of Mercy Merrick. Poor Lady Janet. I noticed those signs of mental decay to which you so feelingly allude at the last interview I had with her in Mablethorpe House. If you can find an opportunity, will you say that I wish her well, here and hereafter? And will you please add that I do not omit to remember her in my prayers? There's just a chance of my visiting England towards the close of the autumn. My fortunes have changed since I wrote last. I have been received as a reader and companion by a lady who is the wife of one of our high judicial functionaries in this part of the world. I do not take much interest in him. He is what they call a self-made man. His wife is charming. Besides being a person of highly intellectual tastes, she is greatly her husband's superior, as you will understand when I tell you that she is related to the Gomerys of Pomery. Not the Pomerys of Gomery, who, as your knowledge of our old families will inform you, only claim kindred with the younger branch of that ancient race. In the elegant and improving companionship which I now enjoy, I should feel quite happy but for one drawback. The climate of Canada is not favourable to my kind patroness, and her medical advisers recommend her to winter in London. In this event I am to have the privilege of accompanying her. It is necessary to add that my first visit will be paid at your house. I already feel united by sympathy to your mother and your sisters. There is a sort of freemasonry among gentlewomen, is there not? With best thanks and remembrances, and many delightful anticipations of your next letter, believe me, dear Mr. Holmcroft, truly yours, Grace Roseberry. Part 3. From Mr. Horace Holmcroft to Miss Grace Roseberry. My dear Miss Roseberry, pray excuse my long silence. I've waited for mail after mail in the hope of being able to send you some good news at last. It is useless to wait it longer. My worst forebodings have been realized. My painful duty compels me to write a letter which will surprise and shock you. Let me describe events in their order as they happened. In this way I may hope to gradually prepare your mind for what is to come. About 3 weeks after I wrote to you last, Julian Gray paid the penalty of his headlong rashness. I do not mean that he suffered any actual violence at the hands of the people among whom he had cast his lot. On the contrary, he succeeded, incredible as it may appear, in producing a favourable impression on the ruffians about him. As I understand it, they began by respecting his courage in venturing among them alone, and they ended in discovering that he was really interested in promoting their welfare. It is to the other peril, indicated in my last letter, that he has fallen a victim, the peril of disease. Not long after he began his labours in the district, fever broke out. We only heard that Julian had been struck down by the epidemic when it was too late to remove him from the lodging that he occupied in the neighbourhood. I made inquiries personally the moment the news reached us. The doctor in attendance refused to answer for his life. In this alarming state of things, poor Lady Janet, impulsive and unreasonable as usual, insisted on leaving Mablethorpe House and taking up her residence near her nephew. Finding it impossible to persuade her of the folly of removing from home and its comforts at her age, I felt it my duty to accompany her. We found accommodation, such as it was, in a riverside inn used by ship captains and commercial travellers. I took it upon myself to provide the best medical assistance, Lady Janet's insane prejudices against doctors impelling her to leave this important part of the arrangements entirely in my hands. It is needless to weary you by entering into details on the subject of Julian's illness. The fever pursued the ordinary course, and it was characterised by the usual intervals of delirium and exhaustion succeeding each other. Subsequent events, which it is unfortunately necessary to relate to you, leave me no choice but to dwell as briefly as possible on the painful subject of the delirium. In other cases, the wanderings of fever-stricken people present, I am told, a certain variety of range. In Julian's case they were limited to one topic. He talked incessantly of Mercy Merrick. His invariable petition to his medical attendants entreated them to send for her to nurse him. Day and night that one idea was in his mind, and that one name on his lips. The doctors naturally made inquiries as to this absent person. I was obliged, in confidence, to state the circumstances to them plainly. The eminent physician whom I had called in to superintend the treatment behaved admirably. Though he has risen from the lower order of the people, he has, strange to say, the instincts of a gentleman. He thoroughly understood our trying position, and felt all the importance of preventing such a person as Mercy Merrick from seizing the opportunity of intruding herself at the bedside. A soothing prescription, I have his own authority for saying it, was all that was required to meet the patient's case. The local doctor, on the other hand, a young man, and evidently a red-hot radical, proved to be obstinate, and, considering his position, insolent as well. I have nothing to do with the lady's character and with your opinion of it, he said to me. I have only, to the best of my judgment, to point out to you the likeliest means of saving the patient's life. Our art is at the end of its resources. Send for Mercy Merrick, no matter who she is or what she is. There is just a chance, especially if she proves to be a sensible person and a good nurse, that he may astonish you all by recognizing her. In that case, only his recovery is probable. If you persist in disregarding his entreaties, if you let the delirium go on for 24 hours more, he's a dead man. Lady Janet was most unluckily present when this impudent opinion was delivered at the bedside. Need I tell you the sequel? Called upon to choose between the course indicated to a physician who is making his 5,000 a year, and who is certain of the next medical baronetcy, and the advice volunteered by an obscure general practitioner at the East End of London, who is not making his 500 a year, need I stop to inform you of her ladyship's decision? You know her, and you will only too well understand that her next proceeding was to pay a third visit to the refuge. 2 hours later, I'll give you one word of honour, I'm not exaggerating, Mercy Merrick was established at Julian's bedside. The excuse, of course, was that it was her duty not to let any private scruples of her own stand in the way, when a medical authority had declared that she might save the patient's life. You will not be surprised to hear that I withdrew from the scene. The physician followed my example, after having written his soothing prescription, and having been grossly insulted by the local practitioners refusing to make use of it. I went back in the doctor's carriage. He spoke most feelingly and properly. Without giving any positive opinion, I could see that he had abandoned all hope of Julian's recovery. "We are in the hands of Providence, Mr. Holmcroft." Those were his last words as he sat me down at my mother's door. I have hardly the heart to go on. If I studied my own wishes, I should feel inclined to stop here. Let me at least hasten to the end. In 2 or 3 days' time, I received my first intelligence of the patient and his nurse. Lady Janet informed me that he had recognized her. When I heard this, I felt prepared for what was to come. The next report announced that he was gaining strength, and the next that he was out of danger. Upon this, Lady Janet returned to Mablethorpe House. I called there a week ago, and heard that he had been removed to the seaside. I called yesterday, and received the latest information from her ladyship's own lips. My pen almost refuses to write it. Mercy Merrick has consented to marry him. An outrage on society. That is how my mother and my sisters view it. That is how you will view it too. My mother has herself struck Julian's name off her invitation list. The servants have their orders, if he presumes to call, not at home. I am unhappily only too certain that I am correct in writing to you of this disgraceful marriage as of a settled thing. Lady Janet went the length of showing me the letters, one from Julian, the other from the woman herself. Fancy Mercy Merrick in correspondence with Lady Janet Roy, addressing her as my dear Lady Janet, and signing yours affectionately. I had not the patience to read either of the letters through. Julian's tone is the tone of a socialist. In my opinion, his bishop ought to be informed of it. As for her, she plays her part just as cleverly with her pen as she played it with her tongue. I cannot disguise from myself I am wrong in yielding. Sad forebodings fill my mind when I think of the future. I feel as if the first contemptuous look that is cast at my husband will destroy my happiness, though it may not disturb him. As long as I was parted from him I could control my weakness, I could accept my hard lot, but how can I resist him after having watched for weeks at his bedside, after having seen his first smile and heard his first grateful words to me while I was slowly helping him back to life? There is the tone which she takes through 4 closely written pages of nauseous humility and claptrap sentiment. It is enough to make one despise women. Thank God there is the contrast at hand to remind me of what is due to the better few among the sex. I feel that my mother and my sisters are doubly precious to me now. May I add, on the side of consolation, that I prize with hardly inferior gratitude the privilege of corresponding with you. Farewell for the present. I am too rudely shaken in my most cherished convictions. I am too depressed and disheartened to write more. All good wishes go with you, dear Miss Roseberry, until we meet. Most truly yours, Horace Holmcroft. Part 4. Extracts from the diary of the Reverend Julian Gray. First extract. A month today since we were married. I have only one thing to say. I would cheerfully go through all that I have suffered to live this 1 month over again. I never knew what happiness was until now, and better still, I have persuaded Mercy that it is all her doing. I have scattered her misgivings to the winds. She is obliged to submit to evidence, and to own that she can make the happiness of my life. We go back to London to-morrow. She regrets leaving the tranquil retirement of this remote seaside place. She dreads change. I care nothing for it. It is all one to me where I go, so long as my wife is with me. Second extract. The first cloud has risen. I entered the room unexpectedly just now, and found her in tears. With considerable difficulty I persuaded her to tell me what had happened. Are there any limits to the mischief that can be done by the tongue of a foolish woman? The landlady at my lodgings is the woman in this case. Having no decided plans for the future as yet, we returned, most unfortunately as the event has proved, to the rooms in London which I inhabited in my bachelor days. They are still mine for 6 weeks to come, and Mercy was unwilling to let me incur the expense of taking her to a hotel. At breakfast this morning I rashly congratulated myself, in my wife's hearing, on finding that a much smaller collection than usual of letters and cards had accumulated in my absence. Breakfast over, I was obliged to go out. Painfully sensitive, poor thing, to any change in my experience of the little world around me, which it is possible to connect with the event of my marriage, Mercy questioned the landlady in my absence about the diminished number of my visitors and my correspondence. The woman seized the opportunity of gossiping about me and my affairs, and my wife's quick perception drew the right conclusion unerringly. My marriage has decided certain wise heads of families on discontinuing their social relations with me. The facts unfortunately speak for themselves. People who in former years habitually called upon me and invited me, or who in the event of my absence habitually wrote to me at this season, have abstained with a remarkable unanimity from calling, inviting, or writing now. It would have been a sheer waste of time, to say nothing of its also implying a want of confidence in my wife. If I had attempted to set things right by disputing Mercy's conclusion, I could only satisfy her that not so much as the shadow of disappointment or mortification rested on my mind. In this way I have to some extent succeeded in accompanying my poor darling. But the wound has been inflicted, and the wound is felt. There is no disguising that result. I must face it boldly. Trifling as this incident is in my estimation, it has decided me on one point already. In shaping my future, of course, I am now resolved to act on my own convictions, in preference to taking the well-meant advice of such friends as are still left to me. All my little success in life has been gained in the pulpit. I am what is termed a popular preacher, but I have never in my secret self felt any exultation in my own notoriety or any extraordinary respect for the means by which it has been won. In the first place, I have a very low idea of the importance of oratory as an intellectual accomplishment. There is no other art in which the conditions of success are so easy of attainment. There is no other art in the practice of which so much that is purely superficial passes itself off habitually for something that claims to be profound. Then again, how poor is the result of which it achieves. Take my own case. How often, for example, have I thundered with all my heart and soul against the wicked extravagance of dress amongst women, against their filthy false hair and their nauseous powders and paints. How often, to take another example, I have denounced the mercenary and material spirit of the age, the habitual corruptions and dishonesties of commerce. In high places and in low, what good have I done? I have delighted the very people whom it was my object to rebuke. What a charming sermon! More eloquent than ever. I used to dread the sermon at the other church. Do you know, I quite look forward to it now. That is the effect I produce on Sunday. On Monday, the women are off to the milliner's to spend more money than ever. The city men are off to business to make more money than ever, while my grocer, loud in my praises in his Sunday coat, turns up his weekday sleeves, adulterates his favourite preacher's sugar as cheerfully as usual. I have often in past years felt the objections to pursuing my career which are here indicated, and they were bitterly present to my mind when I resigned my curacy, and they strongly influence me now. I am weary of my cheaply won success in the pulpit. I am weary of society as I find it in my time. I felt some respect for myself and some heart and hope in my works amongst the miserable wretches in Green Anchor Fields. But I cannot and must not return among them. I have no right now to trifle with my health and my life. I must go back to my preaching, or I must leave England. Among a primitive people, away from the cities, in the far and fertile west of the great American continent, I might live happily with my wife and do good among my neighbours, secure of providing for our wants out of the modest little income which is almost useless to me here. In the life which I thus picture to myself, I see love, peace, health, and duties and occupations that are worthy of a Christian man. What prospect is before me if I take the advice of my friends and stay here? Work of which I am weary because I have long ceased to respect it. Petty malice that strikes at me through my wife and mortifies and humiliates her, turn where she may. If I had only myself to think of, I might defy the worst that malice can do. But I have Mercy to think of, Mercy whom I loved better than my own life. Women live, poor things, in the opinions of others. I have had one warning already of what my wife is likely to suffer at the hands of my friends. Heaven forgive me for misusing the world. Shall I deliberately expose her to fresh mortifications? And this for the sake of returning to a career, the rewards of which I no longer prize. No, we shall both be happy. We will both be free. God is merciful. Nature is kind. Love is true. And in the new world, as well as the old, to the new world we will go. Third extract. I hardly know whether I have done right or wrong. I mentioned yesterday to Lady Janet the cold reception of me on my return to London, and the painful sense of it felt by my wife. My aunt looks at the matter from her own peculiar point of view, and makes light of it accordingly. "You never did, and you never will, understand society, Julian," said her ladyship. "These poor stupid people simply don't know what to do. They're waiting to be told by a person of distinction whether they are or are not to recognise your marriage. In plain English, they are waiting to be led by me. Consider it done. I will lead them." I thought my aunt was joking. The event of today has shown me that she is terribly in earnest. Lady Janet has issued invitations for one of her general grand balls at Mablethorpe House, and she has caused the report to be circulated everywhere that the object of the festival is to celebrate the marriage of Mr. and Mrs. Julian Gray. At first I refused to be present. To my amazement, however, Mercy sides with my aunt. She reminds me of all that we both owe to Lady Janet, and she has persuaded me to alter my mind. We are to go to the ball, at my wife's express request. The meaning of this, as I interpret it, is that my poor love is still pursued in secret by the dread that my marriage has injured me in general estimation. She will suffer anything, risk anything, believe anything, to be freed from that one haunting doubt. Lady Janet predicts a social triumph, and my wife's despair, not my wife's conviction, accepts the prophecy. As for me, I am prepared for the result. It will end in our going to the New World, and trying society in its infancy among the forests and plains. I shall quietly prepare for our departure, and own what I have done at the right time, that is to say, when the ball is over. Fourth extract. I have met with a man for my purpose, an old college friend of mine, now partner in a firm of ship owners, largely concerned in emigration. One of their vessels sails for America from the port of London in a fortnight, touching at Plymouth. By a fortunate coincidence, Lady Janet's ball takes place in a fortnight. I see my way. Helped by the kindness of my friend, I have arranged to have a cabin kept in reserve on payment of a small deposit. If the ball ends, as I believe it will, in new mortifications for Mercy, do what they may, I defy them to mortify me. I have only to say the word by telegraph, and we shall catch the ship at Plymouth. I know the effect it will have when I break the news to her, but I am prepared with my remedy. The pages of my diary, written in past years, will show plainly enough that it is not she who is driving me away from England. She will see the longing for me for other work and other scenes expressing itself over and over again, long before the time when we first met. Fifth extract. Mercy's ball dress, a present from kind Lady Janet, is finished. I was allowed to see the first trial, or preliminary rehearsal, of this work of art. I don't in the least understand the merits of silk and lace, but one thing I know, my wife will be the most beautiful woman at the ball. The same day I called on Lady Janet to thank her, and encountered a new revelation of the wayward and original character of my dear old aunt. She was on the point of tearing up a letter when I went into her room. Seeing me, she suspended her purpose and handed me the letter. It was in Mercy's handwriting. Lady Janet pointed to a passage on the last page. "Tell your wife with my love," she said, "that I am the most obstinate woman of the two. I positively refuse to read her, as I positively refuse to listen to her, whenever she attempts to return to that one subject. Now give me the letter back." I gave it back and saw it torn up before my face. The one subject prohibited to Mercy, as sternly as ever, is still the subject of the personation of Grace Roseberry. Nothing could have been more naturally introduced or more delicately managed than my wife's brief reference to a subject. No matter, the reading of the first line was enough. Lady Janet shut her eyes and destroyed the letter. Lady Janet is determined to live and die absolutely ignorant of the true story of Mercy Merrick. What unanswerable riddles we are! Is it wonderful if we perpetually fail to understand one another? Sixth extract. The morning after the ball. It is done and over. Society has beaten Lady Janet. I have neither patience nor time to write at length of it. We leave for Plymouth by the afternoon express. We were rather late in arriving at the ball. The magnificent rooms were filling fast. Walking through them with my wife, she drew my attention to a circumstance which I had not noticed at the time. "Julian," she said, "look round among the ladies, and tell me if you see anything strange." As I looked round, the band began playing a waltz. I observed that a few people only passed by us to the dancing room. I noticed next that of those few, fewer still were young. At last it burst upon me. With certain exceptions, so rare as to prove the rule, there were no young girls at Lady Janet's ball. I took Mercy at once back to the reception room. Lady Janet's face showed that she too was aware of what had happened. The guests were still arriving. We received the men and their wives, the men and their mothers, the men and their grandmothers, but in place of their unmarried daughters, elaborate excuses offered with a shameless politeness wonderful to see. Yes, this was how the matrons in high life had got over the difficulty of meeting Mrs. Julian Gray at Lady Janet's house. Let me do strict justice to everyone. The ladies who were present showed the needful respect for their hostess. They did their duty. No, overdid it is perhaps the better phrase. I really had no adequate idea of the coarseness and rudeness which have filtered their way through society in these later times, until I saw the reception accorded to my wife. Days of prudery and prejudice are days gone by. Excessive amiability and excessive liberality are the two favourite assumptions of the modern generation. To see the women expressing their liberal forgetfulness of my wifely misfortunes, and the men their amiable anxiety to encourage her husband. To hear the same set phrases repeated in every room. So charmed to make your acquaintance, Mrs. Gray. So much obliged, dear Lady Janet, for giving us this opportunity. Julian, old man, what a beautiful creature. I envy you, upon my honour, I envy you. To receive this sort of welcome, emphasised by obtrusive handshakings, sometimes actually by downright kissing of my wife, and then to look round and see that not 1 in 30 of these very people had brought their unmarried daughters to the ball, was, I honestly believe, to see civilized human nature in its basest conceivable aspect. The new world may have its disappointments in store for us, but it cannot possibly show us any spectacle so abject as the spectacle which we witnessed last night at my aunt's ball. Lady Janet marked her sense of the proceeding adopted by her guests by leaving them to themselves. Her guests remained and supped heartily, notwithstanding. They all knew by experience that there were no stale dishes and no cheap wines at Mablethorpe House. They drank to the end of the bottle, and they ate to the last truffle in the dish. Mercy and I had an interview with my aunt upstairs before we left. I felt it necessary to state plainly my resolution to leave England. The scene that followed was so painful that I cannot prevail upon myself to return to it in these pages. My wife is reconciled to our departure, and Lady Janet accompanies us as far as Plymouth. These are the results. No words can express my sense of relief. Now that it is all settled, the one sorrow I shall carry away with me from the shores of England will be the sorrow of parting with dear, warm-hearted Lady Janet. At her age, it is a parting for life. So closes my connection with my own country. While I have Mercy by my side, I face the unknown future, certain of carrying my happiness with me, go where I may. We shall find 500 adventurers like ourselves when we join the emigrant ship, for whom their native land has no occupation and no home. Gentlemen of the statistical department, add 2 more to the number of social failures produced by England in the year of our Lord 1871. Julian Gray and Mercy Merrick. End of Epilogue. End of The New Magdalen by Wilkie Collins. Recording by Peter Keeble, Nottingham, United Kingdom.